Medic is TF2's sole dedicated healer. His cause is more noble and pure than anyone else's. In a game as chaotic as this one, it's scary being on your own. You never know what might be waiting for you around the corner, or lurking right behind you. You're going to get hurt. There's no avoiding it. You can fight your enemies off, but your battle scars will quickly turn into battle wounds. And once you've been beaten and battered, and you're on your last legs, just as you're about to abandon all hope, Medic is the one who can patch you back up. Medic is a savior. He's a lifeline for his team. He's also, by some definitions, incredibly overpowered.
What?
See, unlike most traditional healers, TF2's Medic is far from pure. True to his psychotic personality, Medic is an agent of chaos and destruction. He can heal you, sure, but the reality is that he's using you to achieve his true goal, the Ubercharge, an ability that, once activated, grants both the Medic and his patient 8 seconds of invincibility. Nothing can match the sheer destruction of a well-timed Uber. It is the single most powerful thing in the entire game, which makes Medic the single most important class in the entire game. Through the power of the Uber, Medic in TF2 is a force multiplier. If a team is good without a Medic, then they'll be great with one. If a team is great without a Medic, then they'll be nearly unstoppable with one. There isn't a single other class that has this much influence on the outcome of a match. A team with a Medic will beat a team without one 9 times out of 10. But the downside of being a multiplier is that anything times 0 is still 0. A Medic on a bad team is nothing more than a free kill, which the enemy will gladly take advantage of over and over again. His personality may be a subversion of traditional tropes, but in terms of game design, Medic has to deal with the same core issue as any other healer. Everyone wants a healer on the team, but most people don't want to be the healer. Medic is incredibly powerful, to the point of being practically mandatory. But if he's not fun to play as, that can lead to frustrating lose-lose situations, where you either get crushed because your team didn't have a Medic, or you switch to Medic yourself at the cost of your own fun. And with so many aspects of TF2 being balanced around Medic and his Uber, making him fun enough for people to actually want to play the class was Valve's #1 priority. If I had to sum up Medic's balance history in one word, it would be progress. He might just be the class with the least amount of nerfs. Medic has only gotten better and better since TF2's launch. Yet, as we'll find, Medic has also become a victim of his own success. A cautionary tale of how more buffs don't always translate to more varied playstyles. This is the evolution of Medic. Upon TF2's release, Medic was immediately recognized as a mandatory choice for any good team. This fact alone wasn't surprising, given that Medic had been a powerful class in Team Fortress Classic. What was a surprise, however, was how radically different this new iteration of Medic was. Back in Team Fortress Classic, Medic wasn't your typical passive healer. He was a well-rounded generalist, thanks in large part to his concussion grenades that basically acted as a sticky jumper, capable of launching Medic across the map without any self-damage. The gameplay you're seeing now? Yeah, that's Medic. He was basically a better scout. I mean, he literally had Scout's nail gun, but stronger, and Scout's shotgun, but stronger. Medic could instantly heal people to full using his medkit, and even buff teammates to 50 extra health. But with how fast-paced Team Fortress Classic was, medics were typically going on the offensive, rather than waiting around in the backline to heal. Even the medkit itself could be used offensively, by infecting enemies and causing damage over time. Team Fortress Classic still had free-for-all deathmatching baked into its DNA. The level of actual teamwork in the game was, in Robin Welker's own words, shallow. As he'd recall in an interview from 2017, quote, "I feel like we had a shallow understanding of teamwork, and so we did obvious stuff. There's a combat medic. A medic is an obvious class to build if you're trying to have people care about each other. But this is the core problem of multiplayer game design. You're trying to get a bunch of people to work together as a team, but they want someone else to play medic. They want someone else to defend the base. Come Team Fortress 2, their solution to this issue came in the form of the Medigun. Instead of slapping a medkit onto a teammate and conk jumping away, Medic in TF2 was designed to be... how do I put this? He was designed to be more... intimate? The Medigun, unlike the medkit, heals at a slow and steady rate, meaning a medic can't instantly heal you to full and run off to do something else. Not that TF2 medic has much to do besides healing, as all of his offensive capabilities from Team Fortress Classic were stripped away. No more conk jumping, no more infecting enemies, no more shotgun, and the super nail gun was swapped for the inferior needle gun. TF2 medic needs to rely on his team for his own protection, meaning if a medic is latching onto you, he's practically telling you, I think you're pretty good, now let's go kick some ass. You then have a massive incentive to protect your medic and keep getting healed, otherwise known as being pocketed. Keep your medic alive for long enough and he'll be able to use another new addition to TF2, the Ubercharge. 8 seconds of full invulnerability in an FPS is a dopamine rush for both the medic and his pocket, and serves as positive reinforcement to continue the loop of medics seeking out good pockets and good pockets protecting their medics. Voila! People working together, not because they're forced or pressured to, but because it's in their best individual interest to. Designing medic was, according to Robin Walker days before TF2's official release, among Valve's proudest achievements. Quote, "We always wanted to build a support class where when you chose him, you didn't feel like you were having to step down in any way, that you were making a secondary choice, that you were somehow giving up a part of your own success to be that person. And similarly, you weren't relegating your gameplay to some non-fun thing where you get to stand behind the combat around the corner and never come around." To the TF team, they felt confident that they were on the right track with Medic when, throughout their internal playtesting, some of their best and most hardcore FPS players switched to playing Medic almost exclusively. Their only regret with the class was that they couldn't figure out how to get needles to stick onto enemies and, quote, recreate that Indiana Jones pincushion guy. To those that hadn't played TF2 yet, all of this sounded pretty awesome. But when players finally got their hands on the game and tried out this new and improved medic, they were unimpressed. Early reviews of TF2 were almost unanimously positive, but one of the most common criticisms was that medic wasn't all that fun to play as. By December of 2007, once Valve started publicly releasing their data on TF2, medic was by far the least played class in the game, with a paltry 5% of total playtime, meaning on a full team of 12, there was a 56% chance that team didn't have a medic, which was a big problem because Valve had sorta designed the entire game around the assumption that people would be playing medic. One of Valve's biggest goals for TF2 was for the average match to have the same pacing as a well-crafted single-player game, oscillating back and forth between chaotic highs and calm lows. Team Fortress Classic was nothing but constant movement and fragging, so for TF2, Valve had to slow things way down. They've removed grenades, including the aforementioned conch grenades, which had given classes insane mobility. They gutted bunny hopping, a tech that allowed any class to move at insane speeds, fast enough to evade even sentries. Speaking of, sentries were made even stronger in TF2, in part because those insane mobility options had been removed. Less mobility also made choky maps feel even chokier, explosive spam even harder to pass through. Basically, TF2 was designed to be very stalemate prone, and Valve felt comfortable doing this because they'd also designed the Ubercharge to be the ultimate stalemate breaker. Things might be slow for a while, with sentry nests and spam and the like, until bam, some guy that's completely invulnerable runs in and total chaos ensues. If the game doesn't end then and there, things will inevitably slow back down as players respawn, sentries go back up, until the next Uber tears all that down a minute or two later. This is the exact type of pacing that Valve wanted for TF2. Low points and high points. Calm, then chaos. But the entire system hinges on people playing Medic and staying alive long enough to get those Ubers. Otherwise, games might be nothing but low points, which isn't just boring, it can be what prevents a team from winning. I think this article from September 2007 sums up players' frustrations with Medic best. Quote, "I play the Medic, as I prefer to win than to have fun. Or rather, it's impossible for me to have personal fun when my team is losing due to a problem I've noted. An impassable turret bottleneck? Troops when they've penetrated 2 forts are heavily wounded whenever they reach the basement? Medium far from our spawn point in a war of attrition? That'll be a Medic we'll be needing, and we'll continue losing until someone becomes one. When I realize this, it annoys me so much that I can't even faintly enjoy myself until someone makes the jump. And the easiest way to relieve that symptom is to swallow the pill myself." A class not being popular isn't the end of the world. But with Valve making Medic mandatory for the game to flow properly, they needed him to be popular enough that at least 1 out of every 12 players would want to play him. And it's an objective fact that this was not the case. To Valve's credit, many people did find Medic fun to play, but only when they were on a competent team. It takes 2 to tango, and likewise, it takes being competent yourself and having a competent pocket to have fun playing Medic. In that case, Medic can be very fun. Following your pocket into the thick of battle, putting all of your focus on dodging enemy fire and finding the best spots to position yourself, eagerly watching that Uber meter fill up until you can finally pop it and let your pocket wreak havoc. That's likely what playing Medic had felt like during Valve's internal playtesting. The problem was that if a skilled Medic didn't have competent teammates, he couldn't survive on the front line. Good movement and game sense went a long way, but a Medic couldn't be where the action was and stay alive long enough to get Uber unless his team was also protecting him. And Valve's own data showed that the average pub Medic was not being protected. On average, they stayed alive for a measly 35 seconds per life, the lowest average lifetime in the game. Which was another issue, because getting full Uber takes a minimum of 40 seconds, and realistically takes a minute or longer. Meaning, not only was Medic the least played class in the game, but even when someone did play him, they were usually dying before they could get a single Uber off. If a Medic on a bad team wanted to get Uber, they had to stay far away from the fight, meaning their gameplay was relegated mostly to bumming around pressing M1 on teammates. Despite this, the few that considered themselves to be Medic mains persevered, and quickly learned the fundamental strategies that good Medics still use to this very day. First and foremost, spend as much of your time healing as possible. Healing in TF2 is hard to come by, especially back in 2007. It was also the only way to build Uber, and Uber is the single most powerful thing in the game. Even if no one was injured, Medics could still overheal teammates to up to 150% of their max health, giving them a huge advantage in any fight. This wasn't Team Fortress Classic anymore. If you weren't healing, you were probably throwing. Now, let me interject here by acknowledging that the needle gun was not worthless. In fact, it's perfectly designed for what Valve intended it to be, a self-defense tool. Needles are slow, meaning if you want to try going on the offensive as Battle Medic, you'll need to lead your shots, which doesn't really work beyond very close range. But if you're on the defensive, backpedaling as an enemy is chasing you, putting up a wall of needles can rack up a surprising amount of damage. With Medic's unique 107% run speed, the second fastest in the game, backpedaling only makes him slightly slower than the 100% speed classes. The needle gun's painfully long 1.3 second reload also means Medics can only reliably defend themselves against enemies that are already weakened, further boxing usage of the needle gun into self-defense only. Bit of a side tangent, but I've always hated how reloading the needle gun doesn't actually match the visuals at all. Usually, your clip is reloaded once your class adds ammunition to the weapon. Makes sense. But with the needle gun, you can clearly see Medic add in a new round of needles, yet the clip isn't actually reloaded. Anyways, the needle gun wasn't Medic's only option for self-defense, as players quickly learned that the bonesaw had a disgustingly high crit chance, making it an effective way to threaten enemies into keeping their distance. The most skilled medics were even able to use enemy attacks to their advantage. They'd jump in time with being hit to get launched away by the knockback, a technique known as surfing. And as a last resort, if a medic sensed that they were on the verge of death, they could use their Uber if they happened to have it charged. As the saying goes, pop it, don't drop it. Skilled medics were also constantly on the move to make it harder for enemies to reach them in the first place. You don't need to keep your crosshair directly on your target to heal them, so good medics were always watching their backs and using corners and props to their advantage. Another reason to always be on the move was to spread the heals. Yes, finding a good pocket was an important part to playing the class, but most medics at the time took this to mean glue yourself to whoever's top scoring and ignore everyone else. Skilled medics knew to heal everyone, not just to be nice, but because it was the best way to build Uber, as healing someone that's near full overheal or being healed by another beam cuts your Uber build rate in half. Lastly, and this is perhaps the most well-known medic strat of all, when in doubt, find a heavy. Heavy's biggest weakness, getting chipped down by enemies that know to run and corner peek, is fixed by the medic's steady healing, while overheal brings Heavy up from an already beefy 300 health to a gargantuan 450. Outside of coordinated focus fire, which was a very tall order for players back in 2007, the only things that could reliably take out an overhealed Heavy were a backstab or a fully charged headshot. All of these strategies are still effective today, which might lead you to believe that stock medic hasn't changed much since TF2's launch. However, this is far from the truth, even ignoring the unlocks. Spoiler warning, yes, medic will get unlocks. The class has gotten a lot of changes over the years. So, to make this interesting, I'm not gonna list out every difference between medic on release and medic today. Keep your eyes peeled throughout the video and see how many differences you can spot. I can guarantee that you'll miss at least some of them. For example, did you notice that you're looking at a major difference right now? Originally, Medic didn't build Uber any faster during setup time, so unless you were lucky enough to have teammates that knew to self-damage, you wouldn't have full Uber by the time the gates opened. This was changed on December 20th, though the patch notes were a bit misleading. The Uber rate wasn't actually increased. Instead, the Uber rate penalty on overhealed teammates would no longer apply during setup, meaning you could always get Uber with 40 seconds of healing. Another difference was that originally, you had to hold the mouse button down to heal someone. The option that made the medigun stay attached automatically wasn't added until January of 2008. I know some people still prefer holding the mouse down, but personally I think just clicking on someone to heal them is way better. Then there were the bugs and oversights. Originally, medics could continue to heal enemy spies even after they dropped their disguise, which is just too funny. Like, imagine the griefing potential with pocketing a gun spy on the other team. This was fixed pretty early on, just 3 weeks after TF2's official release. The needle gun had an incredibly strange bug, where if a teammate stood on a ledge, you could aim up from underneath them and launch them into the air, which was referred to at the time as medic boosting. Standing on a dispenser worked as well, so particularly crafty medics could boost friendly engineers into the many broken sentry spots that had also been overlooked. The medigun, meanwhile, had a massive oversight, where switching weapons mid-Uber would preserve whatever Uber you had remaining, meaning you could pop Uber for a few seconds, switch weapons to store it, then whip it back out later. This, as well as medic boosting, were both fixed in late December. The most game-breaking medic exploit at the time, however, wouldn't be fixed until April of 2008, 6 months after TF2's launch. And it involved a technique known nowadays as flashing. When you start healing someone mid-Uber, they'll get the invulnerability immediately. But if you stop healing them, they'll stay invulnerable for about a second, meaning you can theoretically have multiple teammates ubered at once by repeatedly switching targets, or flashing them. The downside is that for every teammate that you flash, your total uber time decreases. But at TF2's launch, this downside did not exist. So long as you could keep more than one teammate within your range, there was no reason not to uber multiple people at once. It wasn't until April that the time penalty was added, making flashing much less powerful, but still an option worth considering. For the first few months of TF2's life, updates were small and mostly consisted of bug fixes like these. But Medic needed much more than simple bug fixes. The class needed some spice, something to make him engaging to play as, even when stuck on a bad team. Thankfully, it didn't take very long for Valve to realize this, as shortly after TF2's release, they began working on their first ever major content update, the Gold Rush update, otherwise known as the Medic update. The fact that Medic got the very first class update is insane when you realize that Pyro was a broken, pathetic, directionless disaster of a class at the exact same time. Medic's only issue was that he was kinda boring. Yet, the first update went to him. Getting more people to play Medic was just that high of a priority to Valve. By January of 2008, a mere 3 months after TF2's launch, work on the update had already progressed to the point that Valve felt comfortable showing off some of their ideas to PC Gamer, including a new game mode where players had to escort a cart throughout the map, as well as new unlockable weapons for the Medic. They even revealed one of the unlocks that they had been working on, the Overhealer, a medigun that would have given teammates a 200% overheal that didn't decay. My god, could you imagine if this actually made it into the game? 250 health scouts, 400 health soldiers, 600 health heavies. By March, Valve had already given up on the Overhealer, stating in an email to one player that, quote, "The Overhealer didn't work out as well as we wanted it to, and won't be making an appearance." Their new idea, as Robin Walker would explain in a separate series of emails with IGN, was a medigun that swapped invulnerability for guaranteed critical hits. There had apparently been a lot of internal debate at Valve over whether guaranteed crits were better or worse than invulnerability, which, to Robin Walker, was a sign that they were on the right track. With this being TF2's first ever major update, the one that would lay the groundwork for all major updates to follow, it was only natural that Valve would experience some growing pains as they figured things out. But this is Valve we're talking about, one of the most influential game studios of all time. Surely their first big update for TF2 would go off without a hitch, right? On April 16th, Valve invited writers from big-name gaming websites like IGN and Kotaku to meet and share some more details on the upcoming update. They met not at Valve headquarters, but Blondie's Bar and No Grill in San Francisco. Just imagine stepping into a random bar in 2008 only to find Robin Walker talking about a TF2 update that hadn't even come out yet. By the end of the meeting, each writer was given a list of the new Medic achievements, the ones that players would need to complete to get the new unlocks. Each website put out their own articles sharing these new achievements, and the response from the player base was largely negative. Some of the achievements were completely fine, like healing an engineer while his sentry was under fire, or giving enemies a freeze cam shot of you taunting over their ragdoll. Achievements like these were either likely to happen naturally if you were a good medic, or were easy enough to pull off on your own. Where players took issue were the many achievements that either encouraged bad behavior, were insanely unlikely to happen, or both. For example, to get "You'll Feel a Little Prick," you needed to assist in getting 4 kills from a single Uber on a scout. Pretty easy nowadays, but at the time, medics didn't copy their target's speed when healing them, making Scout one of the worst classes to Uber, since they'd either have to keep stopping to let you catch up, or run out of your range and get nuked the moment they lost their Uber. To get Big Pharma, you had to get 30 kill assists with the same heavy, without either of you dying, forcing you to become the worst kind of medic, one that healed a single heavy and no one else. For sawbones, you needed to hit enemies with your bone saw 10 times in a row without dying or missing. Most ridiculous of all, to get the Chief of Staff achievement, you needed to accumulate 10 million total heal points. And unlike today, if you wanted all 3 milestone unlocks, you'd have to get every single one of these achievements. People complained, and by the time the update finally dropped on April 29th, Valve had thrown the player base a bone by nerfing some of the most insane achievement requirements. Still, that wasn't enough to dissuade many players from trying to get these achievements through illegitimate means. Valve had anticipated this, as the update also came with a fix to how the game recorded stats to, quote, prevent players using SV cheats to easily garner achievements. SV cheats, for those unaware, is a server setting that lets you use what are effectively cheat codes, like noclip for flying around the map. Yet, just a few hours after the update went live, some sort of loophole had been found. Players were getting not just all of the new medic achievements, but every single achievement in the game instantly. How were they doing this? What lengths were people going to outsmart the technological titan that was Valve? Well, the loophole that players had found was a bit complicated, so bear with me. First, they'd join any server or just make one themselves. Next, they'd open up the console. Last, and this was the most difficult step of all, they had to carefully, precisely type in the following command: achievement unlock all. I swear, I'm not making this up. Valve made this command that instantly gives you every achievement in the game, presumably for testing, and just forgot to remove it. One day later, the command was removed, and everyone who was caught using the command, like if they got the Chief of Staff achievement with less than 1 million heal points, had all of their medic achievements revoked, even if they'd gotten some of them legitimately. With the removal of the command, players resorted to forming Steam groups and filling up custom achievement servers to help each other grind out the achievements. Annoying, but at least they could be sure they wouldn't get in trouble. This next part I can't fully verify, but there were enough players reporting the same thing at the same time for me to buy it. Apparently, the code Valve used for flagging cheaters had a bug that led to false positives, resulting in many players who hadn't used the command getting their achievements wiped and losing the unlocks that they'd earned legitimately. Come May 2nd, now 3 days after the update's release, Valve sent out emails to those who had been wrongfully flagged, explaining that they'd be restoring their achievements and even giving these players all 3 unlocks as compensation for the trouble. Robin Walker himself concluded these emails with, "Have fun with the Ubersaw." Oh, that's right, the new weapons. All this drama just for the achievements. I haven't even gotten to the unlocks themselves. Starting with the Blutsauger, which was unlocked after completing 1/3 of the medic achievements. This was a replacement for the needle gun that restored 3 health for every needle hit. That might not sound like much, but at the time, it was a major boost for a medic's survivability. Unlike today, medic's passive health regen originally maxed out at just 3 health per second, and was as low as 1 health per second if the medic had recently taken damage. The Blutsauger's healing wasn't nearly enough to make a battle medic anything more than a gimmick, but it often did allow a fleeing medic to escape with their life. The Blutsauger's healing also helped medics improve their aim. This was before damage numbers and hit sounds, which weren't added to the game until December 2009 and January 2010 respectively. By looking for any +3s to appear at the bottom of the screen, medics could immediately tell whether they were landing their needles or if they needed to readjust their aim. Those +3s would even appear when hitting disguised spies, letting medics spy check without needing to walk into them and risk getting backstabbed. As for downsides, the Blutsauger only had one. It couldn't deal critical hits. That's right, Valve's first unlock officially added to the game had a variation of the infamous no random crits as its sole downside. The Blutsauger was basically a straight upgrade to stock. It wasn't overpowered. If anything, Medic needed some sort of boost to his survivability, but locking a direct upgrade behind those tedious achievements certainly wasn't a good look. Next was the Kritzkrieg, thankfully spelled with a K and not a C like in the update page. God, is that a cursed image. Requiring 2/3 of the Medic achievements to be unlocked, the Kritzkrieg was the crit-granting medigun that Valve had talked about before the update dropped. They'd said that they weren't sure whether guaranteed crits or guaranteed invincibility was better, but in the end they must have sided with the latter, as the Kritzkrieg also boasted a 10% faster Uber rate. Which, yeah, it's pretty common knowledge nowadays that while a crit's Uber is potentially devastating, it's also extremely risky. Medics couldn't pop it as a last resort to save themselves like they could with stock, and unlike today, they couldn't even taunt to heal themselves. It was supposed to have its signature Oktoberfest taunt, but a coding oversight led to it using the default medigun taunt instead. In general, the original Kritzkrieg was broken to an embarrassing degree. Its Uber didn't crit boost melees, didn't work at all on servers with random crits disabled, and the increased Uber rate just flat out wasn't active. As such, the Kritzkrieg was horribly underpowered and not worth using. Unless, of course, you wanted to enter God mode, in which case having the Kritzkrieg was all you needed. By using Uber with the stock medigun and switching to the Kritzkrieg, the timer for ending that Uber would be removed in the process, giving you infinite Uber. You couldn't take out the Kritzkrieg, otherwise the game would realize that something was amiss and remove your Uber. But you were free to frag to your heart's content with the needlegun and bonesaw. The Kritzkrieg was so broken that it gave Valve their first ever taste of how, if they weren't careful, new content could lead to new game-breaking exploits. Last but not least, we have the Ubersaw, which required all 36 of the Medic achievements to be unlocked. If you wanted the Ubersaw, you had to go out of your way to grind for it. Was it worth all the effort? I mean, it's the Ubersaw. What do you think? It released with the same stats that it has today. In exchange for a 20% slower firing speed, each hit with the Ubersaw would grant you 25% Uber. This was pure genius. The Ubersaw was the spice that Medic needed. One of the biggest hurdles to designing unlocks for Medic is that since healing and building Uber are so important, any unlocks that don't contribute to at least one of those things will not shake up Medic's gameplay in any meaningful way. Like the Blutsauger, it was a straight upgrade to the needlegun, but only because it was the needlegun, just slightly better. Good medics using the Blutsauger played exactly the same as with the needlegun. And if they wanted to shake things up by going battle medic, they were throwing because they weren't healing or building Uber. Not saying battle medic isn't fun, not saying everyone always needs to be playing to win, but since Uber can often be mandatory for a game to progress, it's a special type of infuriating when your team's medic isn't healing anyone. The Ubersaw then is the best of both worlds. It lets medics play aggressively and build Uber in the process. Just having it as an option makes playing medic more engaging. Staying alive isn't the only thing on your mind anymore. You're also keeping your eyes peeled for any weakened or distracted enemies to smack. You can push deep into enemy territory before you're at full Uber. Risky, but if you've got at least some Uber, all it takes is 1 or 2 clutch Ubersaw hits to completely turn the tables. While Ubered, you can switch to the Ubersaw and hit someone to extend your Uber, leading to some crazy mind games. There's also Uber chains, where 2 medics switch back and forth between Ubering and using the Ubersaw while Ubered. This was before Pyro got Airblast, so if there was an Uber chain ravaging your team, all you could do was try to knock them around with explosives and hope that your teammates weren't clueless enough to keep feeding them Uber. It was incredibly easy to pull off in the average pub, but the strat wasn't overpowered, since realistically, a medic running around with his melee couldn't do much damage. The same could be said about the Ubersaw as a whole. Despite all the options it opened up, despite it making the stock Bonesaw laughably outclassed, the Ubersaw was not overpowered. There was an opportunity cost. If you had your Ubersaw out, you weren't healing anyone. If you whiffed, you weren't building Uber either. and if you underestimated your enemy, you could easily end up dead. Now, despite having the same stats as today, the original Ubersol was different in a few minor ways. Knowing how many hits you needed to get full Uber was a bit tougher, since the HUD didn't originally show what percent your Uber was at. What looked like 75% may have actually been 70%, or vice versa. The Ubersol also used to build Uber from hitting disguised spies, making clueless spies even more of a detriment to their team than they were before. Lastly, the original Ubersol didn't have its current taunt. It used the same taunt as the stock Bonesol. This wasn't a bug like with the Kritzkrieg. Valve simply didn't make a unique taunt for the Ubersol. They did, however, change the sound that the taunt made from a violin to a deeper sounding viola, which is something, I guess. And that was the Gold Rush update, TF2's first ever major update. There was drama. There were exploits. One of the new unlocks was a pretty bland straight upgrade, and another didn't even work right. To Valve, this update was a success. Did it go as smoothly as they'd hoped? Of course not. But the general format of the update, packaging new maps, features, and weapons to be shipped all at once, along with a massive update page detailing all of the changes, was very successful at both getting old players to return and enticing potential new players to see what all the hubbub was about. What about Medic? Did this update get more people to not only play the class, but enjoy playing him? Well, recall how Valve's data from 2007 showed Medic as being the least played class by far. Skipping ahead to their data from May 2008 reveals that, wow, Medic had shot up to being the third most played class in the game. Not only that, but those that played Medic were staying alive for significantly longer, going from an average lifespan of 35 seconds to just over a minute. Especially impressive considering that while the player base as a whole was getting better at staying alive, they were also getting better at killing each other. Most other classes only stayed alive a bit longer on average, going from 07 to 08, while Medic's average lifespan doubled. In the days that followed the Gold Rush update, Valve took care of the achievement command fiasco, as previously mentioned, as well as fixing the Infinite Uber exploit on May 5th, followed by fixing another Infinite Uber exploit on May 7th. On May 9th, the Kritzkrieg was finally given its faster Uber rate, and its Uber not crit boosting melees was fixed. On June 19th, less than 2 months after the Gold Rush update, TF2's second major update would drop, the Pyro update. Valve had learned their lesson when it came to the achievements. Pyro's achievements were not only easier, but players only needed to complete 22 of them to get all the new Pyro unlocks. A few days later, the Medic milestones were changed to also only require 22 achievements. So the Medic achievements had to be nerfed when the Gold Rush update dropped, nerfed again in the Pyro update, and past the Pyro update, some of the Medic achievements would get nerfed on 2 more occasions, once in 2009 and again in 2010. Just puts into perspective how insanely hard Valve had gone with Medic. But I'm not bringing up the Pyro update just to mention the achievements, because this update also blessed Pyro with an incredible support tool, Air Blast. Air Blast could extinguish teammates, reflect projectiles, and, most importantly for this video, knock enemies back, including Ubered ones. The addition of Air Blast completely changed how a team could defend against Ubers. And, in my opinion, it was a change for the worse. I can see an argument being made for how Air Blast is necessary, because it gives defending teams some counterplay against Ubers. Without Air Blast, it can feel like the only response to an Uber is to run away and watch your defenses crumble. Popping your own Uber can save some people, but not everyone. How is that fair? It's not, but that's the point. If your team did nothing but turtle, playing purely passively and reactively, then getting ravaged by the enemy Uber was your punishment. By gluing yourselves to the objective, the enemy medic was able to build Uber completely undeterred and save it for the perfect moment, giving them all 8 seconds of invulnerability to rip your team apart. The counterplay to Uber was to be proactive. Yes, even when on defense. Push up a bit and try to kill the medic before he gets Uber. If nothing else, pushing up would force medics to pop Uber earlier than they'd otherwise like to, meaning they'd only have a few seconds of invulnerability left once they made it to the objective. With Air Blast, turtling teams aren't punished nearly as hard for playing reactively. You can stay glued to the objective and wait for the enemy to come to you. And when an Uber push comes in, your Pyro can react to it by running up and spamming M2. Yes, the Pyro will almost always die, but so long as he was able to waste just a few precious seconds of Uber, it was a worthwhile trade. Granted, I might only find this to be an issue in modern day TF2 because of a certain unlock that puts Ubers on an even stricter timer. But I don't know, I think giving Ubers a bit of knockback resistance against Air Blast would have been fair. Even Heavy's innate knockback resistance doesn't apply to Air Blast, ironically making him an awful Uber recipient against spammy Pyros, despite being the best choice for mowing said Pyros down. The addition of Air Blast didn't dethrone Uber as being the most powerful thing in the game, but it did make turtling harder to punish, which is especially silly considering that the Gold Rush update had already given teams an option for defending against Ubers in a much more proactive way, the Kritzkrieg. The original Kritzkrieg was hilariously broken, but by the Pyro update, most of its bugs had been dealt with. On July 29th, the Kritzkrieg's final major bug, its Uber not working on servers with random crits disabled, was fixed. And a few weeks later, on August 19th, its Uber rate bonus was raised from 10% to 25%, allowing the Kritzkrieg to build Uber in as little as 32 seconds. This bonus, along with its Uber granting crits rather than invulnerability, allows the Kritzkrieg to act as sort of an anti-medigun. Not only can Kritzkrieg medics get Uber first, but critsing someone can let them take out the enemy medic even if they're far away, since crits aren't affected by falloff. This isn't guaranteed to work though, since Kritzkrieg Ubers don't grant any extra protection. Wait too long and your crits Uber might get completely stuffed by the enemy's stock Uber. It's high risk, high reward, making the Kritzkrieg a perfect side grade. Now that all three medic unlocks were viable, the only other changes medic received for the year came months later in December. First, overhealed players would now have particles swirling around them to let others know that they were in fact overhealed. I honestly can't believe that this wasn't in the game from the start, considering how massive of an advantage being overhealed is. The other change was to the icon that appears above a player calling for medic. Up until this point, that icon was always the same white speech bubble regardless of that player's health. This was incredibly annoying for medics because of how often people would spam E and call for medic. You had to physically put your crosshair over them to see if they actually needed to be healed. Now, the icon would change depending on the player's status, like turning red when on low health, or being engulfed in flames when on fire. Did this stop players from spamming E at full health? Of course not. But now, it was much easier to ignore those players, making this a very welcome change. Despite being arguably the most powerful and influential class from day one, Medic did not initially live up to Valve's expectations. They'd purposefully designed healing to require zero effort, so medics could focus all of their attention on survival. But this ended up backfiring tremendously. Practically every team needs a medic, either to break a stalemate, or because the other team has a medic and is therefore at a huge advantage, or both. But medics can only survive on the front line when playing on a team with competent power classes. On those teams, Medic was exactly as fun as Valve had hoped he'd be. However, many teams didn't have competent players that knew to protect their Medic, meaning Valve's worst fear for the class was often a reality. Players did feel like they needed to step down and stop having fun, because someone had to be the Medic. The 3 medic unlocks from the Gold Rush update, alongside a handful of quality of life improvements, went a long way to making medic more engaging and less frustrating to play, all without straying far from his role as the healer and Uber building stalemate breaker. That last part is key. If Valve just wanted to make medic more fun, they could have easily given him a shotgun or something. But then medics wouldn't be spending nearly as much time healing or building Uber. Fine in Team Fortress Classic, not so much in TF2. No, medics need to be spending most of their time healing for the game to flow as Valve intended, meaning Valve's #1 goal was to make the act of healing itself fun. Not an easy task, considering that was the main issue with designing healers in every other game before TF2. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure you subscribe since I've still got 4 classes to cover the histories of after this. And if you think you're already subscribed, do me a favor, just double check, you never know. With that, let's see where Valve takes medic from here. Entering 2009, on January 28th, the default HUD was updated to display your Uber percent when playing medic. On May 21st, the oversight that had prevented the Kritzkrieg from using its Oktoberfest taunt was fixed. This taunt is not only iconic, but it also heals you for 11 health. Nothing crazy, but definitely worth keeping in mind. Pyros being Ubered by the Kritzkrieg would also now turn any reflected projectiles into criticals, which was a smart change, since otherwise Pyro wasn't a great Kritzkrieg candidate. Throughout mid to late 2009, Valve worked behind the scenes with top competitive players at the time in a closed beta version of the game. There, they tested out potential balance changes and even new unlocks. One such unlock was a Medigun, whose overheal didn't decay at the cost of a -50% heal rate. Basically the Overhealer Mark II. And like the original Overhealer, this new Medigun also never saw the light of day. As for potential balance changes, there were only a handful, most of which were straightforward. Should you be able to drop the sandwich? Should the pistol fire at a fixed rate? Should the Force of Nature's knockback only work in close range? Medic's potential changes, meanwhile, were more convoluted. There were 2 nerfed versions of the Ubersaw that were being tested, and 3 for the Blutsauger. The Ubersaw and Blutsauger were not at all overpowered, and they were essential for making Medic more engaging and less frustrating to play as. But the fact that they were both direct upgrades to stock didn't sit well with a lot of people at the time. On August 13th, the Ubersaw and Blutsauger would both receive a minor nerf in the live version of the game. Hitting disguised spies would no longer trigger their on-hit effects. The Blutsauger no longer being able to spy check wasn't a deal breaker, and the Ubersaw farming Uber off of clueless spies was a bit much anyways, so this was a good change. 1 month later, the Blutsauger's no critical hits was swapped out for a new downside, -2 health drained per second. Did this mean using the Blutsauger would actually make you lose health over time? It could have, had Valve not also given Medic a sizable buff in this same update. His passive health regen was raised from 1 to 3 health per second up to 3 to 6. The Blutsauger then technically wasn't nerfed. If anything, it was a bit better than before. It could now deal those coveted crits, and medics using the Blutsauger could regen up to 4 health per second instead of the previous 3. The difference was that the Blutsauger was no longer a direct upgrade. The stock syringe gun had better survivability when you were able to hide and regen your health, while the Blutsauger was better for escaping when getting chased down. Speaking of survivability, this update included another change from the closed beta that benefited medics massively. Heavy's Sandwich could now be dropped to act as a medium health pack. Heavy medic pairs had already been hard to beat, so was this going too far? Not really, since it took several seconds for a Heavy to stop revving, take out his Sandwich, drop it, switch back to his minigun, and rev up again, giving any enemy plenty of time to rush in and pick the medic off. Heavy being able to heal himself was questionable, but healing others was completely fine, and made pairing up with a competent Heavy as a medic even more fun than before. December of 2009, like December of the previous year, came with more quality of life changes. A heal target marker was added in the form of a small team-colored triangle, which hovers over your current patient to help you know exactly who you're healing out of a crowd. The other quality of life addition was the Medic Auto Caller. Last year's icon change had solved the issue of people spamming E when they didn't need to be healed. So now it was time to fix the opposite problem, people not calling for medic when they actually did need it. Remember, medics weren't seeking out injured teammates just to be nice. It's the easiest way to build uber quickly, so people at low health not calling for medic was actually pretty annoying for medic players. With this new autocaller, medics could pick whatever health threshold they wanted for their teammates to automatically signal to be healed. This also inadvertently fixed another common grievance for medics, being left alone and having no idea where the nearest teammate was. Through the use of a script, which I'll include in the description, you can bind any button to set the threshold for the autocaller to 150% health for a split second, essentially acting as a radar that pings all nearby teammates. By the end of 2009, Valve had already done a lot for medic. Basically everything that the class received over those 2 years were buffs and quality of life improvements. Medic was being played more, medics were living longer, mission accomplished, right? Well, not exactly. Medic playtime was high in the months that followed the Gold Rush update, but by November of 2009, that usage was already starting to wane. And while those that played Medic continued to stay alive for longer than most others, the number one question on Valve's mind was, were these players having fun playing Medic, or were they doing it simply because someone had to? Unfortunately, public perception on Medic had hardly changed since 2007. Players found that he was fun when playing on a good team, and frustrating when on a bad one. And practically every team, regardless of their quality, needed someone to play Medic. If Valve still wanted a healer that they were proud of, then there was still a lot of work to be done. Entering 2010, Valve went back to the drawing board. Aside from the Ubersaw getting its Uberslice taunt kill on January 13th, which only added 50% Uber at the time, Medic received nothing of note for the majority of the year. That would suddenly change on September 30th, with the release of the Manconomy update. Between this update and June of 2011, over a span of just 9 months, Medic would be blessed with 6 new unlocks. Surely, Valve must have thought, this embarrassment of riches ought to spice things up. Starting with the Vitasaw, released in the Manconomy update of September, this was a replacement for the Bonesaw that allowed medics to retain up to 20% of their Uber upon death. If you died at 20% Uber, you'd respawn with 20%. If you died immediately after respawning, you'd still have that same 20% on the next life. In exchange, the Vitasaw reduced the wearer's max health by 10. Leaving Medic at 140 health. This would obviously cut into your longevity, but if you were playing on a team that wasn't protecting you in the first place, the Vitasaw basically acted as insurance. No matter how many times you died, you'd always respawn with a 20% head start, shaving a minimum of 8 seconds off the time it'd take to get full Uber with stock. You could even switch to the Ubersaw to get the best of both worlds. Instant 20% Uber, along with the ability to farm more Uber with the Ubersaw. It's also worth noting that the deeper viola sound of the Ubersaw's original taunt was given to the Vitasaw 1 month after its release. In pubs, the Vitasaw was balanced, but situational. It was only really worth considering if your team was bad at protecting you. But seeing how that was exactly the type of environment that playing Medic was most frustrating in, the Vitasaw made for a mildly useful addition to Medic's kit. That was fine though. The Vitasaw was merely a teaser for what Valve had in store next. Because in the Australian Christmas update of December, Medic would receive an unlock that had the potential to change everything: the Crusader's Crossbow. Instead of being yet another rapid-fire needle gun, the crossbow fired one shot at a time, much like the Huntsman. In fact, the Crusader's crossbow originally used the Huntsman's arrows as its projectiles, which is why Valve needed to clarify that it couldn't deal crit damage on headshots. What these arrows could do, however, was heal teammates as well as damage enemies. This was another stroke of genius on Valve's part. Just as the Uber Saw made building Uber more engaging, the crossbow did the same for healing. The most exhilarating parts of playing any combat class are those spontaneous clutch moments, like hitting an airshot, or perfectly timing a reflect, or narrowly dodging an attack. Playing Medic could lead to some clutch moments, like hitting a clutch surf, or landing a clutch Uber Saw. But the opportunities to experience these moments were much less frequent, especially when playing on a bad team. With the crossbow, medics now had the opportunity to give any teammate in their line of sight a massive health boost. If they were about to lose a fight, all it'd take was one clutch arrow to turn the tides. If they were about to die to fall damage, all it'd take was one clutch arrow to save them. In some ways, the crossbow was even better at healing than the medigun. It not only had infinite range, but also healed in a massive burst, ranging from 75 health at point blank up to 150 at long range. This burst healing also wasn't affected by a hidden mechanic known as crit heals. From the game's launch up until this very moment, healing always took significantly longer on players that had recently taken damage, ranging from a sluggish 24 health per second on those who had been damaged within the last 10 seconds, up to 72 health per second on those who hadn't. These varying heal rates were done to prevent pocketed players from being unstoppable meat shields, while also giving injured players a reason to fall back and wait for a medic. With the crossbow ignoring crit heals, it would always heal a minimum of 75 health, even on players that were actively fighting someone, instantly healing what would otherwise take over 3 seconds with the medigun. But unlike the medigun, the crossbow damaged disguised spies rather than heal them, making it a decent spy checker as well. The Crusader's crossbow truly had the potential to change everything. Medics could now heal in massive bursts from any range, all with a weapon that took skill and felt satisfying to use. Valve did it. They managed to make healing fun. And yet, the original Crusader's crossbow was near unanimously agreed upon to be garbage. Not underrated, and not just underpowered, the original Crusader's crossbow was terrible for one simple reason: its reload. The Crusader's crossbow took a whopping 2.3 seconds to reload. And unlike today, it would not reload automatically when switching off of it. The crossbow's reload animation was also, somehow, even worse than the needle guns. After firing an arrow, Medic would stare at the crossbow for a second before realizing he needed to reload it. Then add a new arrow, then put the crossbow back down, and half a second after that, the clip would finally be reloaded. This painfully long reload further exacerbated the opportunity cost to using the crossbow. If you missed, then unless you wanted to go the rest of your life without having an arrow loaded, you had to waste over 2 seconds not healing anyone. If you landed your arrow, you still had to spend those 2 seconds reloading. The potential healing was massive, but it also couldn't overheal, nor did it build any Uber. Another cost to equipping the crossbow was that it was near useless for self-defense. The needle guns weren't world beaters, but when it came to fending flanking enemies off, they got the job done. The crossbow's damage, like its healing, scaled inversely with distance. It could deal up to 75 damage at long range, which was nothing to scoff at, but at point blank, it dealt a measly 38 damage. So unless the enemy chasing you down was at extremely low health, hitting them with your crossbow left you with 2 options: spend over 2 seconds reloading for another shot that still might not kill them, or switch to your melee and pray that they were dumb enough to willingly get in your range. So, as crazy as this might sound, the original Crusader's crossbow was extremely underpowered. It was only useful for those long-range heals, which was useful and was fun, but generally not worth giving up the self-defense of the needle guns. As such, it was rarely used. In addition to the crossbow, the Australian Christmas update also came with another unlock for Medic, the Amputator. This was a replacement for the Bonesaw that, when taunting, would apply a healing effect to all nearby teammates. There was no limit to how many people could be healed at once. If they were within your range, they'd get the effect. The Amputator, like the crossbow, allowed medics to bypass another limitation of the medigun, only being able to heal one player at a time. The Amputator was no slouch when it came to healing either. It healed at the exact same rates as the medigun, 24 health per second for players that had recently taken damage, and 72 health per second for everyone else. Taunting with the Amputator was effectively healing everyone within your range with the medigun all at once, which made it great for farming assists. A common trap with the Amputator that many medics fell into was to park yourself behind a corner and spam the Amputator's taunt over and over. This might seem like a powerful strategy in theory, but not in practice. Standing still as a medic is just asking to get headshot or backstabbed or killed in general. Plus, even if you didn't get killed, spamming the Amputator's taunt simply wasn't efficient. Its healing might be the same as the medigun, but it, like the crossbow, couldn't overheal nor build uber. No, the Amputator's taunt was best used sparingly. Only take it out when you've got a lot of teammates to heal, and only use it once. A single Amputator taunt healed any recently injured player for 105 total health, or 315 health with crit heals. So if anyone was still hurt afterwards, you could easily top them off with the medigun. That might make it sound situational, but needing to heal a lot of teammates all at once was a very common scenario for medics to find themselves in. The Amputator's taunt was a great option for any medic to have. And upon the weapon's release, it came at the cost of nothing. The original Amputator had no downsides whatsoever. The Ubersaw and original Blutsauger at least had a listed downside to hide the fact that they were basically straight upgrades. But when it came to the Amputator, Valve didn't even bother. Did this make the Amputator overpowered? Not at all. The Amputator's taunt was self-balancing. You'd get rewarded for using it at the right time and punished for using it at the wrong time. The fact that it literally had no downside raised some eyebrows, but aside from that, the Amputator was perfectly fine and was used quite a bit. Not as much as the Ubersaw, but it really wasn't far behind. Equipping the Amputator with the crossbow, as well as a Berliner's bucket helm, also formed an item set with a unique set bonus, the Medieval Medic, which boosted Medic's passive health regen by 1. That might not sound like much, but that 1 extra health per second added up over the course of a life. This bonus gave players even more reason to use the already excellent Amputator, and was generally considered to be the reason to bother using the crossbow. In case you haven't figured it out by now, yes, the Australian Christmas update was the same update that added the group keep, which is likely what gave Valve the inspiration to make healing unlocks that weren't mediguns in the first place. Alongside the Australian Christmas update, December also came with the release of another beta version of TF2, with this one being open to the public. And, like with the closed beta from 2009, the main purpose of this beta was for testing new unlocks and balance changes. Among these potential new unlocks, there was the Overdose, a syringe gun that was terrible for dealing damage, but would cover anyone hit by it with mad milk. There was also the Quick Fix, a medigun that couldn't overheal, but boasted plus 50% healing and uber building rates, with an uber that didn't grant invulnerability, but healed incredibly quickly. Basically, the inverse of the overhealer concept that Valve had scrapped on 2 separate occasions. Other highlights included a pocket rocket launcher, which looked just awful to fight against. Imagine getting your entire team wiped by Crockets because you dared to kill the enemy medic. All of these and more were being tested for what was shaping up to be TF2's biggest update ever. Throughout the first half of 2011, the beta tests continued in the background. Like with last year, a random change to the Ubersauce taunt was the only thing that broke the silence. As of April, its taunt kill would now grant full Uber instead of just 50%. Then, on the 20th of June, the massive update that players had been eagerly waiting for was finally revealed, the Uber update. 3 days later, Valve would push out not just the update itself, but also their latest entry to the Meet the Team series, Meet the Medic. No one was surprised that it was Medic, considering that A, there were only 2 classes left by that point, B, the update was called the Uber update, and C, Valve had already announced that it was Medic beforehand. What was surprising, however, was that in the short, Medic could be seen using a brand new Medigun, with an Uber that granted invulnerability to Heavy, but not to Medic himself. Interesting. So I guess they scrapped that quick fix concept from the beta? We'll get to that, but yes, with the release of the Uber update, Medic was given not 1, not 2, but 3 new unlockable weapons. Starting with a weapon that should sound familiar, the Overdose. The original concept of applying Mad Milk was completely scrapped, and, funnily enough, repackaged into an MVM upgrade 2 years after the Uber update. However, the general idea of a utility needle gun remained intact. In exchange for a 10% damage penalty, the Overdose would boost medic speed by 1% for every 10% of Uber they had. At max Uber, taking the Overdose out would grant a 10% speed boost, making medic noticeably faster than usual. But because the Overdose needed to be out to get this speed boost, it, like the Ubersaw and Amputator and Crossbow, was balanced by its opportunity cost. If you had the Overdose out, you weren't healing or building Uber. Also like the Ubersaw and the Amputator, the Overdose was yet another straight upgrade to stock. The 10% damage penalty dropped the damage of each needle at point blank by 1, going from 12 damage per needle to 11. Meanwhile, the Overdose's speed boost made it great for self-defense. A medic backpedaling with max Uber was about as fast as medic's normal run speed, so you could run away from most enemies while attacking them and still outspeeding them. It was also nice for repositioning. If your heals were needed elsewhere, the Overdose would get you there a bit faster. All in all, despite being yet another straight upgrade, the Overdose was balanced, and was generally considered at the time to be the best medic primary, due to its blend of utility and self-defense. Next was the Quick Fix. Wait, the Quick Fix? The Medigun from Meet the Medic, that was the Quick Fix? No one could have known from the short alone, because all throughout the beta, the Quick Fix didn't have a unique model. It looked just like the stock Medigun. So did Valve really rework the Quick Fix from the ground up at the last second? Nope, the Quick Fix largely functioned the same as it had in the beta right before the Uber update dropped. Yet, the Medigun in Meet the Medic is undeniably the Quick Fix. Why does it use the stock Uber, and why is it only on Heavy? The most likely explanation is that this is how the Quick Fix's Uber was originally intended to work. But by the time the Quick Fix was added to the beta in February of 2011, Valve had changed their minds. Further supporting this idea, the beta Quick Fix's Uber originally only applied to the medic's patient, just like the Uber seen in Meet the Medic. It was changed to also apply to the medic himself on March 9th. By that point, Meet the Medic must have been too far in production for Valve to go back and fix it, leading to the bizarre sight of the Quick Fix using the stock Uber. That only affected one person. As for the real Quick Fix seen in the actual game, it was, unfortunately, very undercooked. Back in the beta, the Quick Fix was actually pretty insane. With its healing and Uber rate bonuses both at plus 50%, it could get full Uber in just under 27 seconds. These rates were nerfed down to 40% on June 17th, and when the quick fix was officially added to the game on June 23rd, its Uber rate bonus had been nerfed again, dropping down to plus 25%. This was the same bonus as the Kritzkrieg, so even after the quick fix's nerfs, there were now 2 mediguns that built Uber noticeably faster than stock. But while the Kritzkrieg could be used proactively to push up and take out opposing stock medics, the quick fix could not. Its Uber increased the quick fix's healing by 300% and healed the medic at the same rate. In a 1v1, that was basically the same as being invulnerable, barring crits, backstabs, headshots, and sticky traps. When attempting to lead a push into the enemy team, however, the quick fix's Uber could not outpace all of the damage, especially from sentries. If your patient died mid-Uber, which was very likely, you were almost certain to die immediately after. You originally needed to be healing someone for the quick fix's Uber to affect you. In addition to increased healing, the Uber also granted an immunity to knockback, which could have been useful for pushing through Air Blast spam, but for whatever reason, Air Blast completely ignored this knockback immunity and worked like usual. Rather than being used to push forwards, the quick fix's Uber was best suited for defense, quickly patching up your team so they didn't crumble from an enemy push. Which is ironic considering Medic was originally designed to break stalemates, yet here was a medigun that reinforced them. Beyond Uber, the quick fix's plus 40% heal rate led many to believe that it'd be great for pocketing. Yet, these players would find their pockets dying left and right, because an increased heal rate wasn't nearly enough to counteract the crippling lack of any overheal. In combat, the quick fix only heals about 34 health per second, just 10 more health than stock. The lack of overheal did come with a hidden upside of always building Uber at the fastest rate, but not being able to overheal at all did much more harm than good. There was also the quick fix's unique ability to copy the speed of faster patients. But similar to the knockback immunity not working against Air Blast, this speed copying didn't work for items that boosted speed, like the Eyelander or the Pyro's Gas Jockey set. It only copied Scout's speed. And while being able to pocket and keep up with a Scout was novel, the total lack of overheal meant that a Scout quick fix combo couldn't do much outside of the wide open, unorganized games that Scout already did well in by himself. This ability was best used to temporarily hitch a ride off of your team's Scout, either to get to the fight more quickly or to escape. The quick fix was a massive noob trap. To the uninformed, its upsides seemed more significant than they actually were, and its downsides were easy to gloss over. That's not to say the quick fix was worthless. It was decent on defense, and good when playing on a team that already had a non-quick fix medic. But from the moment the Uber update dropped, quick fix medics were everywhere, often to the frustration of their veteran teammates that knew that Dust Bowl offense was not the time to use the quick fix. The final new unlock of the update was the Solemn Vow, which offered one simple perk, the ability to see an enemy's health. This had a handful of useful applications. It let you make better informed decisions when getting chased down. Should you run, or are they at low enough health that you can take them on? You could use it to snipe low health enemies trying to run away from your pocket with the crossbow. When looking at an enemy medic, you could not only see their health, but their Uber percent. Trying to keep mental tabs on the enemy medic's Uber in a pub was a fool's errand. Yes, it usually takes about a minute to build Uber from scratch, but would you know if the enemy medic just got 25% from Ubersawing your team's clueless spy? Or if they just spent 10 seconds not building any Uber because they were laughing at a funny ragdoll? What if they had more than one medic? Are you going to be able to track all of their Ubers at the same time? With the Solemn Vow, you could immediately know who had Uber advantage. If the enemy's Uber was far ahead of yours, you would know to hang back for safety. And if your Uber was far ahead of the enemy's, you'd know to push forwards. In exchange for this useful ability, the downside of the Solemn Vow was nothing. Yes, the Solemn Vow was another straight upgrade. At least with the Amputator, using the taunt could sometimes get you killed. but the Solemn Vow was just objectively superior to stock in every situation. It wasn't at all overpowered, but by this point, the number of straight upgrades that Medic had was a bit silly. Following the Uber update, the only other Medic-related changes of 2011 came in October. Normally, the voice lines for calling for a medic are loud and desperate, but if a friendly medic is under your crosshair, you'll instead calmly and politely ask that medic to follow you.
Medic! Come on, Doc, follow me!
This is fine for asking a medic to pocket you, not for getting their attention when you're about to die. As of October 13th, players on fire or at low health would now always use the normal, loud voice lines. This was a good change. It served a functional purpose. Louder voice lines are better at getting people's attention. And while they were at it, Valve made another voice line change in this same update. Demos being healed by medics would no longer use the "I didn't need your help, you know" line as an automatic response. This might just be my favorite patch note throughout all of TF2's history. I love how it serves zero functional purpose. It's literally just Demoman is no longer an asshole. We can chalk this up to a massive buff to Medic's self-esteem. By the end of 2011, all but one of Medic's unlocks had already been released. If Valve wanted to make Medic more engaging to play as, adding more viable unlocks certainly wouldn't hurt. Variety is the spice of life after all. But by this point, the same could be said for the other classes. Everyone had lots of options to choose from. So why play Medic? What was Valve doing to make Medic fun in a way that was unique to the class? Well, it seemed like Valve's goal was to make playing Medic more engaging mentally by giving him more options to micromanage. Even during the most boring part of playing Medic, healing people away from the action, you're still keeping those options in mind. Would it be more efficient to heal these people with the amputator? Or this guy with the crossbow? Should you stop healing to go for a risky Ubersaw? Maybe there's another group of teammates on the other side of the map. Should you whip out the overdose and bolt over there? Maybe you want to know what Uber percent the enemy medic's at. Should you try taking a peek with the Solemn Vow? This was a great direction to take the class in, because it makes Medic more fun without altering his role in any way. Valve is never giving Medic his shotgun back. He will always be the game's healer. He will always be spending 99% of his time healing and building Uber. But now, there are more ways to do those things, with each option having its own set of pros and cons to consider. Of course, you can't have access to all of those options at once, but that then leads to another way of making Medic more engaging, needing to pick the right loadout for the job. There was no definitive meta loadout. Every weapon other than the stock bonesaw, needle gun, and arguably the quick fix saw legitimate use from all types of players. Basically, Valve's been doing a great job. Let's see where they go from here. Entering 2012, Valve initially set their sights on fixing the quick fix. On April 18th, the quick fix's Uber was finally made immune to air blast. Insane that it took Valve nearly a year to do this, but better late than never. With this change, the quick fix was still awful for pushing into sentry nests and or choke points. But if your team had already dismantled the enemy's defenses with a stock Uber, then pushing up immediately after with a quick fix Uber was now a lot harder to stop. What made this especially effective was that players being Ubered by the quick fix could still do the objective. They could cap points, they could push the cart, they could pick up the intel, all while getting healed insanely quickly and being immune to knockback. It was a bit cheap, admittedly, but it was also a huge reason to use the quick fix over any other medigun. In the Pyromania update of June, the quick fix was given another fix. It would now copy speed boosts from all sources, not just scouts. This really didn't change much in the grand scheme of things. There are only a handful of items that offer speed boosts, but at least now the quick fix's description wasn't lying when it said it can copy the speed of any faster heal target. Though, wait, what about rocket jumping? Or charging as Demo Knight? Are these not examples of moving at a faster speed too? Well, this was also the update that gave the quick fix an entirely new perk, copying all blast jumps and shield charges from whoever you were healing. Now this was the type of change that the quick fix needed. No, scratch that. This was the type of change that Medic needed. Something bold, something that lets you play the class in an entirely new way. Instead of being annoyed by teammates blast jumping away from you, you could now follow them all over the map. The quick fix's jump copying is a bit unwieldy at first, since you don't copy your target's air strafing or their momentum before jumping, only the force from the blast jump itself. You, as the medic, need to be moving forwards while your target jumps if you want to cover the same distance as them. A bit annoying, but this also means you can prevent your teammates from griefing you by launching you into a pit. Not only can you follow blast jumping teammates into the thick of battle, but you can also get bailed out of bad situations. With a little coordination, a roaming quick fix medic could be incredibly hard to pin down. It wasn't overpowered by any means. This is still the quick fix we're talking about. But it was extremely fun to pair up with a competent explosive class or Demo Knight or Scout and roam the map alongside them. Also included in this update was a massive buff to the Crusader's crossbow. Its reload time was slashed by 40%, going from 2.3 seconds to 1.4. Oh, so did they cut out the full second that Medic spent staring at his crossbow before actually reloading it? Nope. In classic Valve fashion, they just sped up the animation to an absurd degree and called it a day. But animations aside, this single change was all that the crossbow needed to be good. Not mandatory, just good. Even with perfect aim, it was still only useful for long-range healing. Switching to the crossbow, firing an arrow, reloading it, and switching back to the medigun took nearly 3 seconds and healed a minimum of 75 health. In that same span of time, the medigun itself healed 66 health. You could technically heal nearby teammates even faster than with the medigun by using the crossbow exclusively. But then you weren't overhealing or building any uber, and each arrow ran the risk of missing. It simply wasn't worth it to heal people within your medigun range with the crossbow. For healing outside of the medigun's range, however, firing an arrow was now much less of a time commitment than before. This faster reload also made the crossbow better at self-defense, as you could now land multiple crossbows onto an enemy trying to approach you. Following this update, the crossbow was viewed by the player base as being on par with the Overdose, while the Blutsauger wasn't terribly far behind. Let me say that again. This iteration of the Crusader's crossbow was tied for Medic's best primary. The Overdose versus Crusader's crossbow debate was much like the shotgun versus the Rescue Ranger for Engineer today. One offers solid self-defense, while the other trades that self-defense for more support. Here's a poll that was run on GameFAQs a few months after the crossbow's buff, asking whether players used the crossbow or the Overdose. And the results were neck and neck, with the crossbow just barely coming out on top. Or take a look at this Reddit thread from around the same time, asking the same question: crossbow or Overdose? Again, both weapons were seen as about equal. In fact, the majority opinion seemed to be that, in a pub setting, the Overdose was generally the more practical option. Much of the crossbow's popularity came from how fun and satisfying it was to use. Valve had hit the perfect sweet spot with the crossbow. Equipping it no longer felt like you were crippling yourself. Everyone could agree that the Crusader's crossbow was fun. And yet, when asked whether Medic as a whole was fun, players were still, after all this time, giving the same answers they had given back in 2007. He's fun on a competent team and frustrating on a bad one. Players were still frustrated by bad teammates running in to die and leaving them stranded. or not pushing in when Ubered, or not playing any power classes in the first place. Players were still frustrated by there always being at least one player on the other team that knew the importance of medic picks. And players were still frustrated by the fact that practically every team needs a medic. So how was it even possible that, after 5 years of buffs and quality of life fixes and new unlocks, people were still frustrated by Medic's design? Well, all of that work obviously wasn't for nothing. Medic was absolutely more fun and less frustrating in 2012 than he'd been back in 07. But there were two main issues. First, some of Medic's unlocks were only fun when playing with those competent teammates. Like the quick fix. Blast jumping around the map as Medic was, well, a blast. But only if your pocket was smart and knew not to fling you into the entire enemy team. Or the Kritzkrieg. To make full use of its Uber, your pocket needs to have good aim and good dodging skills. If they whiff their shots, chances are you're both going to die because of it. The second and much larger issue was how the unlocks that made playing Medic more engaging on any team, unlocks like the Ubersaw and crossbow, were never your primary weapon when equipped. Yes, the crossbow is in the primary weapon slots, but that doesn't mean it's the weapon you should be using the most. When playing Medic, the weapon that you have out the vast majority of the time is always your medigun. And to use your medigun, you click on your teammates and watch them. Medic still had the same issue that had been plaguing the class since day one. Unless you were lucky enough to be with competent power classes that would protect you on the front line, most of your gameplay was relegated to hiding away from the action and pressing M1 on teammates. Unlocks like the Ubersaw and crossbow made these moments less boring, but it's not like you could spam the crossbow to your heart's content, or run around with the Ubersaw and always have distracted enemies to smack. In the average unorganized pub, most of a medic's playtime was still spent pressing M1 on teammates. They had to. Medics had to stay alive to heal and build Uber. Valve could not change this fact. But what they could do was think of a way to make using a medigun fun all the time and not just when popping Uber. They'd already struck gold with the Crusader's crossbow. They knew it was possible to make healing fun. But healing with a medigun? That's literally just clicking on teammates. How can you possibly make doing that fun? Released in the Mecha update of December 2012, the Vaccinator was Medic's final and most ambitious unique unlock. Rather than having a single Uber, the Vaccinator's Uber was divided up into 4 quarters. Each Uber only used one of those 4 quarters, and would cover both you and your pocket with a damage resistance bubble. That bubble blocked a whopping 75% of damage from one of 3 damage types: explosives, bullets, or fire, which could be changed by pressing the special attack button. The Vaccinator was so ambitious that Valve had to create an entirely new bind specifically for it, with the default for this new special attack being mouse 3, aka pressing in the scroll wheel. Originally, this damage resistance did not apply to the bonus damage from crits or mini-crits, so random crits, the buff banner, the Kritzkrieg, and charged headshots could easily rip through any Vaccinator bubble. Each bubble lasted for a measly 2 seconds, which meant all 4 bubbles would last for the standard 8 seconds. But since those bubbles were meant to be popped individually, a significant chunk of those 2 seconds could be wasted by your pocket reacting to the fact that they'd been Ubered, giving them even less time to actually make use of it. As such, the Vaccinator was best paired with 2 types of pockets: competent players who you were talking to over voice, or, ironically, newer players. In case you haven't noticed, new players in TF2 are constantly out for blood because they haven't yet learned any self-preservation skills, which makes them perfect Vaccinator pockets, especially heavies and pyros, who don't even need to reload. Though, if you did waste a Vax bubble on someone, it wasn't a huge deal. The Vaccinator boasted a plus 50% Uber build rate. And unlike every other Medigun, the Vaccinator always built Uber at the same rate. Even if they were overhealed, even if they were being healed by another medic. Every bubble took a mere 6.7 seconds to build, or 26.8 seconds for all 4 bubbles. While healing someone without popping a bubble, you and your pocket would have a constant 10% resistance to whatever damage type was selected. And with or without a bubble, you would be healed for 25% of damage that would have been dealt to your pocket by that type. With the Vaccinator, medics no longer required their team's protection to survive on the front line. Even snipers, the #1 reason why medics couldn't be out in the open, weren't nearly as big of an issue as usual. Just keep the Vaccinator on bullet resist, and you would never die to a quickscope headshot, while fully charged body shots would only kill you from full health if the sniper was using the Machina. We, unfortunately, can't know for sure what Valve's goal was when designing the Vaccinator. Even the update page didn't say anything. It just had a button that linked to the wiki. But I think it's safe to assume that the Vaccinator was Valve's response to everyone who was still unhappy with Medic's design. You're tired of your teammates failing to protect you? Fine, now your survival is in your hands, but you need to earn it with quick reflexes and split-second decision-making. By memorizing the sequence of resists, bullet, then blast, then fire, then back to bullet, you can learn to switch to any particular resist from any resist near instantly. The Vaccinator was just what the doctor ordered. It managed to make pressing M1 on a teammate fun. When you use the Vaccinator, every interaction feels like a puzzle that tests your knowledge of the game. You can be healing your pocket and suddenly run into an enemy. Quick, what damage type is that enemy using? How much can that weapon deal? And what health is your pocket at? Will the passive 10% resist be enough to win this fight? Or do you need to pop a bubble? Maybe there's multiple enemies using more than one damage type. Which of those types is going to deal the most damage? If you pop the right bubble, will it even be enough? Or should you use that bubble to flee? All of these questions need to be answered instantly. Otherwise, it's too late. You couldn't pop more than one resist bubble at a time, so if you picked the wrong one, you were stuck with it for those 2 seconds. Choose correctly, however, and you'd be rewarded with the massive dopamine rush of watching your pocket eat an absurd amount of damage and still come out on top. Popping a bubble worked like any other Uber. It was a shared state between you and your pocket. If you popped a bubble on one guy and switched to someone else, the bubble would get transferred over to them. If you switched weapons, the bubble disappeared. Unlike stock Uber, however, objectives could still be capped while under a Vax bubble, just like the quick fix. There was just so much to keep in mind when using the Vaccinator, which is what made it appealing to those who'd otherwise never want to play Medic. It was incredibly fun. But was it good? Hard to say. The obscene 75% damage resist bubbles are just so polarizing and so unlike any other Uber. In more open, symmetrical game modes like King of the Hill and 5CP, or in servers with low player counts, the Vaccinator could be incredibly hard to stop. But on chokier maps with higher player counts, it fell off hard because one damage resist would rarely be enough. The Vaccinator's only listed downside, its minus 66% overheal build rate, was also a tough pill to swallow. It was terrible for buffing your team, though the Vaccinator wasn't designed to be a team-oriented medigun in the first place. It was designed for picking out a single teammate to be your test monkey, and, with enough skill on your part, become an unkillable god. I know that nowadays the Vaccinator isn't exactly respected by the player base, and believe me, we'll get to that. But I just can't help but admire the sheer ambition behind this weapon. It truly is one of a kind. There is no other weapon in the entire game that's satisfying in the same way as the Vaccinator. Which, unfortunately, is the same reason why the Vaccinator, despite how fun it can be, has never been popular. Quickly recognizing what type of damage is being fired at you and reacting accordingly takes time to get down, and is a skill that's only useful for the Vaccinator and nothing else. It's also something that's fun in a brainy, puzzly, micromanaging sort of way. I love that personally, but I get that a lot of people play video games to not have to think and just shoot the bad guy. Lastly, don't forget that Medic is practically mandatory for two reasons: spreading heals and breaking stalemates with Uber. The Vaccinator is okay for the former, but awful at the latter. Even if the Vaccinator was popular, it'd be in the same boat as the Quick Fix. Teammates getting annoyed by their medics using a medigun that they couldn't make a big push with. So, despite addressing so many common complaints levied against Medic, the Vaccinator failed to end said complaints. Even after the weapon's release, discourse on Medic was still the exact same as in 2007. Good team fun, bad team frustrating. Had Valve stopped here, if these were the versions of Medic's unlocks that we had today, Medic would be in a fine state. He had several interesting and balanced options to choose from, with no one unlock completely overshadowing the rest or harming the game in any significant way. If people still didn't like feeling forced to choose between going Medic or losing the round, well, they'd just have to suck it up. To Valve, however, fine wasn't enough. They didn't want a healer that was just fine. That was never what they wanted. They still, after all this time, wanted the version of Medic that they had dreamed up years ago. The Medic that never made players feel like they were stepping down or giving up a part of their success by choosing. The Medic that wasn't relegated to hiding away from the action, never to come out. Valve just wanted people to find Medic fun, damn it. Not just on a good team, but on any team. And to achieve that, they were just gonna have to give Medic more, and more, and more. Following the release of the Vaccinator, it was quickly buffed in the massive summer update of July 2013. Its Uber would now block all bonus damage from crits and mini-crits, which is to say, landing a crit on someone with a Vax bubble would deal the same pitiful damage as with a non-crit. This gave medics and their pockets even more protection against snipers than before. It also protected medics from another thing that had previously dissuaded them from entering the front line: random crits. It even allowed the Vaccinator to help teams withstand cheaters, since previously, crits from headshots or crit bucket hacks would still rip through Vax bubbles. With this being such a big change, Valve felt it necessary to tack on a new downside. Any bonus crit damage absorbed by a Vax bubble would deplete extra Uber in exchange. The patch notes claim that the amount of Uber depleted depended on the damage prevented, which sounds simple enough, but no, it actually depended on the type of damage. Any crit from a bullet weapon depleted 3% Uber per shot. Crits from fire-based weapons depleted 1% Uber per flame particle or flare, and any crit from an explosion wiped a whopping 75% Uber. So if you popped an explosion bubble to save yourself from a Crockett, you would always lose nearly all of your Uber. This was better than dying, of course, but it meant that the Vaccinator couldn't fully counter the Kritzkrieg, since you'd quickly lose all of your bubbles before the enemy's crits wore off. Or at least, that was the idea. But in classic Valve fashion, they messed up the coding and accidentally made it so that the Vaccinator was always immune to the crit damage of whatever type was selected, with or without a bubble. And since they'd coded this new Uber draining mechanic to only happen when under a bubble, blocking crit damage through normal healing didn't drain any Uber. You were just immune to crits from any one type, 24/7 for free. Kinda game-breaking, but the Vaccinator wasn't particularly popular, even with knowledge of this bug in mind. And surely it wouldn't be too hard for Valve to spot and fix. This same update also came with a huge buff for the quick fix, one that players had been clamoring for ever since the weapon's release. It would now be able to overheal teammates, though only up to 125% of their max health instead of the usual 150. For buffing multiple teammates before a fight, this still wasn't great. It only took 7.5 seconds for the quick fix's overheal to fully decay. But this did make the quick fix much better at pocketing, and synergized well with mirroring blast jumps from teammates by letting them do so without crippling their health in the process. It also improved the quick fix's uber by making it much less susceptible to high burst damage. Speaking of, that uber was also changed to finally heal medic with or without a pocket, letting medics save themselves when caught alone or escape when their pocket inevitably dies mid-uber. Lastly, the quick fix's uber would no longer be susceptible to knockback from shotguns? So just the force of nature? I mean, they forgot about air blast affecting the quick fix's uber for an entire year, so I can't say I'm surprised that they also forgot about the fan. Like how they also forgot to include the detonator and scorch shot in their list of weapons to mirror blast jumps from, which would be fixed 2 weeks later. All in all, these were great changes for the quick fix that made it feel like a fully fleshed out unlock. It was still debatably underpowered, but between mirroring blast jumps, hitching rides off of faster classes, a heal rate that was faster than stock, an uber that built faster and could still cap objectives, the quick fix now offered enough unique perks that equipping it opened up several options that weren't possible with any other minigun. The Crusader's crossbow, meanwhile, received a handful of aesthetic changes. Its projectile was no longer a huntsman arrow, but a large syringe, one that had a new trail of team-colored crosses when fired. They did it. The absolute madmen. Valve finally achieved their dream of recreating that Indiana Jones pincushion guy with medic's needles. They also, at long last, smoothed out the reload animation, so medic would no longer stare at his crossbow for a second before reloading it with inhuman speed. There's still the issue of the crossbow not actually reloading until after medic puts a new arrow in, but whatever, I'll take what I can get. The last change to medic in this update was the removal of the medieval medic set bonus of +1 health regen, as this was the update that removed all item set bonuses. This was technically a nerf to both the crossbow and amputator, but it wasn't a deal breaker for either weapon. The amputator still had its niche of healing multiple injured teammates at once. And the crossbow still allowed for those clutch long-range arrows that everyone loved pulling off. They were perfectly balanced. All of medic's unlocks by this point were balanced to near perfection. I mean, just look at medic's primaries. You could use a clunky, weak needle gun, or the same needle gun that also healed you a tiny bit, or the same needle gun a third time, but it made you a little faster. Or a healing crossbow that you'd shoot maybe a few times before getting effortlessly picked off. There was no clear winner. Choosing one of these unlocks over the others came with both pros and cons. That's how weapons in TF2 are supposed to be balanced, right? That's the approach Valve had been taking with medic for the past 6 years. Hell, they even cheated a bit. Most of medic's primaries and melees were direct upgrades from stock. Valve only tried to keep those unlocks balanced relative to each other. They restrained themselves. They held themselves back for the sake of weapon diversity. And for what? Players were still making the same complaints about medic that they had in 2007, back when there were 0 unlocks. So why keep holding back? Why keep scattering all these options and mechanics and niches between different weapons? Thus, in the Scream Fortress update of 2013, Valve opted for the nuclear option. The Crusader's crossbow would no longer be a medic primary, but the medic primary. As of this update, the Crusader's crossbow would now reload automatically when holstered. Originally, it took 3 seconds for the crossbow to reload this way. Oh, so now reloading passively is an option, but comes at the cost of that reload taking twice as long as reloading manually. Then, just 3 days later, the holster reload time was lowered to 1.5 seconds, matching the manual reload time. That update also lowered the crossbow's max damage to 50. Okay, so they made the crossbow even better for support, but worse for self-defense. Got it, that makes total sense. But just a few weeks later, its max damage was reverted back to 75. You can just feel Valve's restraint slipping away. No more balancing unlocks around the other unlocks. Just give the crossbow everything. Needing to manually reload was the thing that had kept the crossbow in line with the needle guns. Remember, it was the crossbow's 3-second downtime per arrow that made it only worth using for healing people out of your medigun range. The addition of a passive reload cut that 3-second downtime in half. Switching to the crossbow, firing an arrow, and immediately swapping back now took just 1.3 seconds. Not only did this make it easier to justify throwing out long-distance crossbow shots, but for the first time, the crossbow was now worth using on people within medigun range. In the 1.3 seconds it took the crossbow to heal its usual 75 health minimum, the medigun only healed 32 health on those who had recently taken damage. This is what turned the crossbow from good to practically mandatory. By equipping it, you were drastically increasing your potential healing output, not just at long range, but at every range. As I'd said after the crossbow's first reload buff, yes, you could technically already do this by healing exclusively with the crossbow, but then you weren't overhealing or building any uber. Being able to use the crossbow in tandem with the medigun was the key here. Heal someone up with the medigun like usual, but if they take a big hit, patch them up with an arrow and switch right back to the medigun. Or if you've got multiple injured teammates to heal, alternate between getting them to near full health with the crossbow and overhealing them with the medigun. The crossbow's reload becoming passive also made it even better for self-defense. Shoot an arrow at mid-range as an enemy approaches you, then switch to your melee and force them back with the threat of a random crit. Then switch back to your crossbow and get another mid-range shot off. When compared to the needle guns, particularly the overdose, this new crossbow was generally still worse for self-defense. But it hardly mattered. Equipping the crossbow boosted your healing output by so much that it was actually worth dying a bit more often in exchange. Plus, with the crossbow now being effective at keeping pockets alive mid-combat, medics weren't being left without a meat shield to hide behind as often as with the needle guns. Admittedly, landing those arrows on teammates that were actively fighting someone could be tricky. It's hard to predict how a teammate will react to an enemy as they fight them. But with the crossbow now being the assumed equipped primary, players out of combat began to stand still when calling for medic, making it dead easy for their crossbow medic to patch them up with an arrow, and making them feel like an idiot if they had anything other than the crossbow equipped. Thus, the crossbow's popularity compounded upon itself, making it even more popular. The Crusader's crossbow was now the medic primary to use. The other options simply couldn't compare. Which raises an important question. Is that a bad thing? Well, it's complicated. First, does this new Crusader's crossbow hurt the game as a whole? I don't think so. From the perspective of a non-medic player, the most common complaint made about the crossbow is that it can rob you of a kill. Like, ugh, I should have won, but of course they got healed by a random arrow. And while this can be frustrating, it has nothing to do with the crossbow itself. Would you not feel the same if you lost an encounter because their team sniper randomly body shot you? Or their scout randomly popped out of nowhere and picked you off? Or their spy randomly backstabbed you? One thing I am curious about is to what extent the crossbow ignoring crit heals affects the flow of the game. When getting pocketed, chip damage was always easy to brush off. But if you took a big hit, it was gonna take a while for your medic to heal you back up. So you'd either have to hog up the medic's healing for several seconds, preventing him from overhealing anyone else, or retreat for a health pack. Either way, the person who landed that big hit had accomplished something, even if they didn't kill you. With the crossbow, however, any big hit can be fixed in an instant. This is undoubtedly a massive shakeup to Medic's original design. But how exactly does it affect the game? Does it slow the game down by making it harder for teams to push off of damage? Does it speed the game up by letting teams keep up momentum and not need to fall back? If the crossbow does do one of those things, would that be a positive change or a negative one? What if it does both? Would their effects cancel each other out? It's hard to say, and we don't have much to go off of other than theory crafting and anecdotal evidence from when the item servers go down. The second thing to consider is, even if the crossbow doesn't hurt the game as a whole, does it hurt Medic as a class? Also hard to say. When you ask people what their favorite part about using the crossbow is, they almost always say the same thing: landing those clutch arrows to save someone. And that's what the previous iteration of the crossbow could do just fine, without completely overshadowing all other options. With the addition of the passive reload, the crossbow undoubtedly became even more fun to use. But it came at the cost of making using any other primary feel like you were gimping yourself. It also gave players less reason to use the amputator or the quick fix. Their main draw was being able to patch multiple people up quickly, which the crossbow could now do on top of its usual long-range healing, while still letting you use the Ubersaw or stock medigun respectively. The Crusader's crossbow is incredible. There's no denying that. It's incredible how elegantly it solves the age-old issue of designing any healer character, that of healing not being fun. This isn't even the crossbow's final form, by the way. It gets even better from here, if you can believe it. But hypothetically speaking, would playing Medic be more fun with one ultimate loadout that does it all, or with several good loadouts that each have their own pros and cons? Again, hard to say. But for better or worse, the Crusader's crossbow was now the Medic primary to use. Alongside the buffing of the crossbow, Medic had received a few other changes at the same time. On October 29th, Medics were given the ability to see their pocket's clip count, a very good change for helping Medics time their Ubers, and not, say, crits a demo that had 0 stickies loaded. On October 30th, the Vaccinator's unique special attack for swapping resistances was itself swapped out for the reload button. Another good change, considering how pressing the scroll wheel could accidentally cause it to, scroll and switch your weapons. It's not a perfect solution, since pressing R means not having a finger to use for WASD, so really, just rebind it to whatever you think is best. On November 21st, the Amputator received a much-needed reworking. It had been a solid melee option just a few months prior, one that gave even the Ubersaw a run for its money. But the 1-2 punch of its set bonus getting removed, followed by the buffing of the crossbow, left the Amputator struggling to stand out. With this update, the Amputator was given an actual downside for the first time, a minus 20% damage penalty, leading to each swing dealing 52 damage, or 156 damage with a crit. Medics using the Amputator could no longer rely on their melee two-shotting any light class without a crit. Though, to be fair, the odds of the Amputator getting a crit in at least one of those two swings was still quite high. On the plus side, the Amputator also received a new perk of regenerating plus 3 health per second when deployed, leading to a minimum of 6 health per second, assuming you didn't have the Blutsauger equipped. Notably, taking this new Amputator out prevented any health loss from Afterburn, as this was back when Afterburn only dealt 6 damage per second. And even beyond saving yourself from afterburn, 3 more health per second was a great boost to your longevity in general. However, unlike the old item set bonus, you could only get that plus 3 health per second while the amputator was out. This added yet another factor to consider when weighing the pros and cons of taking the amputator out. At any moment, you could get a noticeable boost to your health regen at the cost of not being able to overheal or build uber. You could still heal teammates, but that of course would lock you into the taunt, the use of which had its own set of pros and cons to consider. While the Ubersaw was the melee of choice for aggressive medics, this new amputator was great for those that enjoyed the micromanaging and min-maxing aspects of medics gameplay, which unfortunately led to usage of the amputator, like with the vaccinator, remaining quite low. Only the more experienced medics were able to fully appreciate what the amputator brought to the table. And even then, it being able to heal multiple teammates more quickly than with the medigun was no longer unique after the recent buffing of the crossbow. The amputator, despite being a great unlock in a vacuum, languished in the shadows of both the Ubersaw and the crossbow. By the end of 2013, Medic's weapon diversity had taken a massive blow. It didn't have to be this way. Just 1 year prior, all of Medic's unlocks had coexisted peacefully. Yet, it wasn't enough. Players were still complaining about Medic being too frustrating to play on bad teams. Then, in December of 2012, came Valve's response, the Vaccinator, a medigun that was tailor-made to address those complaints. This, too, wasn't enough, leading Valve to take the nuclear option in late 2013, buffing the Crusader's crossbow far beyond its competition by allowing it to reload passively. This single change not only left every other medic primary in the dust, but it also stole some of the spotlight from the amputator and quick fix. If Valve's goal was to make Medic more fun, then they arguably succeeded. Playing Medic with this new crossbow was way more fun than with any one loadout from before this buff. But there's something to be said about how variety can further enhance your enjoyment of a class, or a game in general. Regardless, Valve wasn't quite done with Medic yet. Would they continue this path of putting all of their eggs into one basket, or would they spend TF2's final years of active development buffing Medic's other unlocks to preserve the weapon variety that was beginning to slip away? You can probably already guess, but who knows? There's only one way to find out for sure. Skipping past 2014, which had no notable changes for Medic, we arrive at 2015, the year that Valve started making serious attempts to quote-unquote modernize TF2. The gunmetal update of July introduced, among other things, unusual weapons and weapon skins, with the latter clearly taking a page from CSGO. Everyone knows nowadays that gambling is awesome, and that 90% of gamblers quit right before they hit it big. But back in 2015, many TF2 players needed a little bit of a push. Thus, the gunmetal update also introduced an entirely new mechanic, the ability to pick up and use dropped weapons, including those shiny, expensive ones. Putting aside the frankly gross psychological manipulation at play here, this was a fun addition to the game, one that mostly had little effect on actual gameplay. The one exception was with dropped mediguns. Any medigun that was dropped by killing a medic would always retain however much uber that medic had. If you killed a medic that had full uber, that uber would literally drop to your feet for any medic on either team to pick back up. Oh no. This decision completely warped the flow of the game around medic, significantly more than before. If you pushed up with an uber and your team killed the enemy's medic, you could pick up their medigun and get a potentially massive head start on your next uber. Had they died with full uber, you'd immediately know from the unique electrical sounds and visuals as the medic died. Imagine that, pushing in with one uber, then following it up with another uber directly afterwards. On the other hand, if you got picked off within your team's territory and the enemy didn't push in, you could casually respawn and retrieve your medigun, picking right back up where you'd left off. If only one team had a medic, they'd now have an even greater advantage, since they'd always be able to pick up their dropped Ubers without any risk of it being used against them. Being able to pick up dropped mediguns either reinforced stalemates or strengthened snowballs, depending on circumstances largely out of any one medic's control. It was, as one Reddit user at the time put it, like a bipolar Vitasol on steroids. Oh right, the Vitasol, the unlock that sacrificed 10 precious health points to retain up to a measly 20% of your Uber. Its usefulness in pubs was already debatable before gunmetal, but now? Don't even bother. If you die, it's either you pick up your medigun and get all of your Uber back, or the enemy medic takes your medigun, meaning any Uber you retain upon respawning with the Vitasol will have already been surpassed by the enemy. By this point, the only melee that was even close to the Ubersol was the Solemn Vow. And wouldn't you know it, gunmetal was the update to finally give it a downside. Thankfully, the downside given to the Solemn Vow was laughably ineffective. A 10% slower swing speed, which translates to the Solemn Vow taking 0.08 seconds longer to kill a light class in 2 swings. The Solemn Vow was not overpowered by any means. Valve giving it this downside was purely out of principle. Plus, I guess the new weapon dropping mechanic was kind of a buff to the Solemn Vow, since you could see what Uber their medic was at and know whether it was worth picking up their medigun if they died. I know, I'm grasping at straws here. Lastly, gunmetal came with a long list of changes to none other than the Vaccinator. And when I say long, I mean long. Seems like Valve wasn't ready to call quits on the Vaccinator just yet. First, the nerfs. The bug that had given Vaccinator pairs full crit immunity, which had been in the game for 2 whole years, was finally fixed. The healing that the Vax gave for picking the right resistance type was decreased from 25% of incoming damage down to 10%. The Vaccinator's Uber build rate was given the same penalty as the other mediguns when healing someone that was maxed overhealed or being healed by another medic. And for good measure, the Vax received a new downside of a 66% decreased Uber build rate on overhealed patients. Those final 2 nerfs meant that the Vaccinator's bubbles took much longer to build when no one nearby was injured, taking well over a minute to get all 4 bubbles as opposed to 27 seconds like before. Next, the buffs. Every Vax bubble now lasted for 2.5 seconds, up from 2. That might sound worthless, but no, this was actually a significant change. Now, your patient has enough time to both react to the fact that they've been given a bubble and actually do something with it. And 4 bubbles in a row now last for 10 seconds. Those bubbles would now also fully block the bonus damage from crits without draining any extra Uber like before, allowing the Vaccinator to still stonewall enemy Kritzkrieg Ubers and protect from random crits and sniper headshots even after the crit bug was fixed. Okay, so far, these changes have all been reasonable, but they didn't really change how the Vaccinator played. If the original Vaccinator had failed to entice people, these minor tweaks weren't going to win them over. Which is why, for the final changes made to the Vaccinator, Valve completely overhauled how its Uber worked. Until now, the Vaccinator's bubbles worked like any other Uber. Heal someone while the Uber was popped, and they'd instantly get the effects. Stop healing them, and they lost the Uber. Gunmetal changed the Vaccinator's bubbles from an Uber to a party buff taken straight out of an RPG. Once a bubble was given to a teammate, they kept it for the entire 2.5 seconds, even if you stopped healing them. Multiple bubbles could now be given to multiple different teammates at the same time. Last, but certainly not least, popping a bubble with the Vaccinator no longer locked you into that resistance type. You could now switch and stack resistances on top of each other. These changes radically increased the number of possibilities when using the Vaccinator. And while the player base was left contemplating those possibilities, Tough Break rolled around a few months later with 3 more changes for the Vaccinator. The self-healing was removed outright. The Uber rate bonus was increased from plus 50% to plus 67%, and the Uber rate penalty on overhealed patients was lowered from 66% to 33%. That was a lot. All of those changes were for one weapon, not just simple number tweaking either. Valve went through the effort of completely changing how the Vaccinator's Uber functioned. It shows just how badly they wanted this unlock to work. They wanted the Vaccinator to be fun, even to those who wouldn't normally want to play Medic. And you know what? They did it. They'd just made the Vaccinator one of the most addicting weapons to use in the entire game. But in doing so, they'd also created a monster. Most of the changes that had been made to the Vaccinator were relatively harmless. Bubbles are now a bit faster to build, at just 6 seconds each, but take much longer when your patient is overhealed. The self-healing was completely removed, but now bubbles last slightly longer and offer full crit resistance. It was the overhauling of the Vaccinator's Uber, being able to stack resistances and maintain bubbles without healing, that turned the Vaccinator from potentially powerful to disgustingly oppressive. First, every resistance bubble is now 2 resistances in 1. As soon as you pop a bubble on someone, there is 0 reason not to immediately cycle to another resistance type and get the passive 10% resistance to that type on top of the 75% resist for the type of the bubble itself. If your pocket is taking heavy fire from multiple sources, no problem. Just pop a second bubble and switch to the third type to have resistance to all 3 types with just 2 bubbles. For every damage resist that you apply, you're boosting the effective health of you and your pocket and the effective healing of your medigun. When given a bubble, a non-overhealed pyro or demo has an effective 700 health against that damage type. A non-overhealed soldier has an effective 800 health. Heavy, 1,200 effective health, and all of them are being healed at an effective 96 health per second. Medic himself, under the effects of his own bubbles, has an effective 600 health. Before gunmetal, these insane numbers were tolerated because they could only be done against one damage type at a time. The Vaccinator forces you to play on the front line where all the action is, the same place where any unprotected medic not using the Vaccinator is dead meat. When an enemy inevitably got in your face, then sure, you could pop an appropriate bubble to save yourself. But then you were stuck with that bubble for the next 2 seconds. From the perspective of the other 2 damage types, you were just as much of a sitting duck as if you weren't using the Vaccinator at all. Which was an extremely common occurrence because, again, the design of the Vaccinator forces you to position yourself aggressively. The best counter to the Vax really was good old teamwork. Not even coordinated teamwork, just having different damage types attacking the Vax pair at roughly the same time was more than enough to overwhelm them. This, however, is no longer the case. If you throw multiple damage types at a Vax pair at the same time, they now just need to pop 2 bubbles instead of 1. Plus, by attacking a Vax pair, you're actually helping them by keeping the pocket out of overheal and speeding up their Uber build. And here's the kicker. A change from gunmetal that I'd failed to mention made the Vaccinator's bubbles significantly more disposable than they were before, making spamming and stacking them even more effective. Originally, popping a Vax bubble would erase any partially filled quarter and slowly drain the Uber of the last filled quarter throughout its duration, similar to with any other medigun. Popping 1 bubble could potentially be more like popping 1.5 bubbles due to that partial quarter erasure. However, this had to be changed in gunmetal to allow the vaccinator to stack multiple bubbles onto multiple teammates at once. Now, popping a bubble immediately depletes the quarter charge of the Vax's Uber. And as a possibly unintended consequence of this, the vaccinator will continue to build Uber while you're already Ubered. Popping a bubble is actually popping half a bubble, because by the time the bubble is done, you'll have already regained half of that charge. All of this is already insane. But what really pushes the vaccinator over the edge is the fact that bubbles now remain on players even after you've stopped healing them. Being able to spread multiple bubbles to multiple teammates is not an issue. I think that's actually a really interesting and underutilized application of the weapon. No, the issue is that once you've popped a bubble on someone, you're free to switch to any other weapon. Allow me to introduce you to the Sigafu Save 2.0. Pop a bubble on someone at low health, then switch to the crossbow to instantly heal an effective 300 health minimum against that damage type. You heard that right. Crossbowing someone with a bubble is the equivalent of throwing a full health heavy meat shield in front of them. The downside is that by switching off of the Vax, you yourself lose that bubble. But you're also making your pocket practically immortal, so all you need to do is position yourself behind your pocket and let them soak up all of the hits. It's just not fair, plain and simple. The vaccinator is not fair. Yes, an enemy is always harder to beat when they've got a pocket medic, but that's because they're two players working together. It's not much different than an enemy being harder to beat because they've got a second power class alongside them. With any other medigun, and even the original vaccinator, it wasn't unreasonably difficult to overwhelm an enemy with a pocket medic. Don't be stupid and try to take them on by yourself, just stick by your team and you'd be able to fend them off with the power of numbers alone. The only exception was arguably a heavy medic pair, but all it took was a single backstab or max charge headshot to take that heavy out. Alternatively, all it took was flanking the pocket to take the medic out. With this new vaccinator, everything I just said flies out the window. It now takes an extremely disproportionate amount of effort to take down a vaccinator pair, in a very similar manner to the Wrangler. No, the vaccinator is the Wrangler, but for players instead of sentries. Melee counters the Vax, you say? Not when the best classes to pocket with the Vax, Heavy and Pyro, can easily chew up anyone attempting to get into melee range, with the latter obliterating Spy. Heavies being Vax pocketed are also less susceptible to Spies. They have such a massive effective health pool that they can afford to turn around much more often than usual. The only things that prevent the vaccinator from being a direct upgrade from stock are that it's still terrible at overhealing your team and at breaking stalemates. But in many situations, being able to make someone practically immortal is more than worth it. In many situations, not all, but many, the vaccinator has the potential to be the single most overpowered weapon in the entire game. However, not just anyone can achieve that level of power. In the hands of an average medic, the vaccinator is still very frustrating to fight against, but not overpowered. No, reaching the vaccinator's full potential requires a skill set and mindset that are entirely unique to it. This had been true since the vaccinator was first released, but the changes made to it in gunmetal and tough break shot the weapon's skill ceiling through the roof. Valve took the micromanaging and split-second decision-making that they had been sprinkling throughout Medic's kit and crammed all of it into this one loadout. Using this new vaccinator with the crossbow can easily consume 100% of your mental capacity. If you're with your pocket and a lone enemy turns the corner, then yeah, just pop the appropriate bubble and watch as that enemy deals no damage. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you're on the front line, taking heavy fire from every angle. For every single second that you're playing, you need to decide what passive resist to have up, when to pop a bubble, what second passive resist to switch to if you do pop a bubble, whether to pop a second bubble as well. For each bubble that you pop, you need to keep track of that 2.5 second timer so you can be ready to switch back if necessary. You need to know whether you should keep healing with the Vax or if you should switch to the crossbow. Know whether any bubble you pop should be used to push forwards or fall back to safety. And knowing which of these options is best depends on a multitude of factors. What's your patient's health at? What's your health at? How much health do you think the enemy has? Where's the enemy fire coming from? What are the damage types? How much damage is each type dealing? How long can your patient survive with or without a bubble? How much damage can your patient dish out to them? Once you make it past the vaccinator's initial learning curve, all of these questions and more begin to run through your head, consciously and subconsciously at all times. Like a gambler glued to a slot machine, the vaccinator can easily suck you in. It is genuinely mesmerizing once mastered. And what really makes the vaccinator so addicting is that your ability to keep someone alive can always be improved. You can always get better at making the right split-second decision. Your reaction time can always be faster. Those that dedicate themselves to using the vaccinator do so out of morbid curiosity. Just how far can you take this thing? How absurd does it really get? I myself had gotten into using the vaccinator a few years ago for this very reason, and my findings were sickening. I'd have games with kill streak counts in the 40s because I refused to let anyone kill me. I'd watch teammates shrug off what would have dealt hundreds of damage, one enemy after another, all throwing themselves at this one guy, trying and failing to take them out because I refused to let them die. And the entire time that I used the vaccinator, I was asking myself, is this okay? Is it okay that the vaccinator can instantly give teammates hundreds of effective health? Is it okay that I'm forcing the enemy team to exert such an absurd amount of effort just to kill a single person? I mean, the stock medigun can make someone invincible for 8 straight seconds. If that's okay, why would the vaccinator be any different? Nowadays, the vaccinator is almost universally agreed upon to be overpowered, if not in need of a total rework. But it took years for this to become the majority opinion, because that's how long it took for players to learn how to really, and I mean really, abuse the vaccinator to the fullest. After the Tough Break update gave us this current version of the vaccinator, it completely flew under the radar. People didn't really talk about it. And when they did, they mostly said the same things they'd said about the vaccinator before Gunmetal and Tough Break. That it's good against cheaters and good when the other team is stacking one class, but otherwise not worth the trouble. In fact, throughout most of this section, I've been forced to cheat and use my own footage from modern day TF2, because you cannot find anyone abusing the vaccinator like this back in 2015. So I can't blame Valve for not fully understanding the monstrosity that they had created. They just wanted to make playing Medic more engaging. And my god, did they succeed. I truly do believe that the vaccinator is the most addicting weapon to use in the entire game. Maybe that says more about me than it does about the vaccinator. It's just such a shame that years after the fact, long after Valve stopped making balance changes, their vision for the vaccinator finally became a reality, only for players to realize how toxic it was once mastered. Valve accomplished their goal after all. They really did manage to make healing with a medigun fun. But in retrospect, leaning fully into the damage resistance angle was a mistake. Perhaps if they'd gone in the other direction, lowering the resistances and upping the self-healing that the vaccinator once had, it could have been balanced. A vaccinator that made Medic harder to kill, but only when he had a patient to latch onto, all without making that patient significantly harder to kill than usual. Alas, that wasn't the direction that Valve chose, leaving us with the vaccinator that we know today. Finally, moving on from the vaccinator, the Tough Break update included a handful of other medic changes that, thankfully, won't take nearly as long to cover. The Ubersaw's taunt was changed to also be activated via right-click, letting you taunt kill without needing to go through the taunt menu that had been added in the Love and War update 1 year prior. This change was also made to the Amputator's taunt for the same reason. Speaking of, the Amputator was also heavily nerfed by a global change that was made in Tough Break. Unlocks that offered health regeneration perks, including the Amputator, were changed to only restore 1 health per second at first and scale up to their maximum rate after 10 seconds of not taking damage. This was listed as a change for the Conch and Cozy Camper, but not the Amputator. And, unlike those unlocks, the Amputator does not get its health regen boost passively. Meaning, you'll now always start at just 1 extra health per second whenever you take the Amputator out as opposed to the previous 3, because it will always get reset to 1 whenever you switch off of the Amputator. It also resets upon taking damage, so the Amputator can no longer prevent losing health from afterburn like it could before. This was a massive blow to the weapon. The health regen boost had been a legitimate reason to use the Amputator over the Ubersaw, and now that upside is utterly useless, thanks in part to another change from this very update that I'll get to later. On the bright side, Tough Break also gave the Amputator a sizable buff. Healing via the Amputator's taunt would now grant Uber for the first time, building 1% Uber for every 49 health healed. Alright, so the Amputator may have lost its faster health regen niche, but being able to heal multiple people quickly while still building Uber was arguably even more useful. Perhaps this could be the new reason why people would want to equip the Amputator over the Ubersaw. Unfortunately for the Amputator, no one, not a single soul, cared that it could now build Uber, because this same perk was given to another, much more popular medic unlock, the Crusader's Crossbow. Yes, the Tough Break update also included a massive buff for the crossbow. Its syringes would now build Uber when healing teammates, 1% per 16 health healed, making for a max of 9% with a single long-range arrow. The buffs for the crossbow didn't even stop there, because Tough Break also included a global change that benefited the crossbow massively. The base weapon switch speed was lowered from 0.67 seconds to 0.5 seconds, which tipped the risk versus reward of using the crossbow even more in its favor. Switching to and from the crossbow now only took a single second, which, at minimum, healed 75 health and built 5% Uber. Using the medigun on an injured teammate within that same 1 second only healed 24 health and only built 2.5% Uber. Put another way, you only had to hit 1 out of every 2 arrows to match the medigun's Uber build, or 1 out of every 3 arrows to match the medigun's healing. Theoretically, through the use of long-range arrows, you could now get 100% stock Uber in less than 20 seconds. Are you kidding me? So you're telling me using the crossbow not only increases your healing output, but your Uber rate too? Why would you ever use anything else? You could abuse this to the fullest by having an explosive class self-damage in a corner, which actually saw use in competitive play. But even in unorganized pubs, using the crossbow would regularly result in a faster Uber build. For every long-range arrow you healed someone with, you'd get a burst of Uber that outpaced what would have been gained with the medigun. This new crossbow not only left the needle guns even further in the dust, and not only stole even more of the spotlight away from the Amputator, but it threatened to further overshadow another unlock too, the Quick Fix. The Quick Fix healed more and built Uber faster, but its Uber was a total downgrade from stock. The crossbow let you heal more and build Uber faster with any medigun. What did the Quick Fix even have to stand out anymore? Being able to capture objectives while Ubered? Nope, that was removed in this same update. Granted, this probably never should have been a thing in the first place, but it stripped away yet another layer from an unlock that was looking more and more basic with each update. Oh, but don't worry. If you still want to cap the point while Ubered, Valve's got you covered. They removed it from the quick fix, but not the vaccinator. Lastly, Tough Break gave Medic 2 general buffs. During setup time, Uber build rates would now be 3 times faster than usual. This is on top of the change from 2007 that removed the Uber penalty on overhealed patients during setup, which had previously let you get stock Uber in 40 seconds. That was all you needed if you'd picked Medic from the start, but what if you were playing a different class and noticed that your team didn't have a Medic? If you went back and switched to Medic, chances are you wouldn't get Uber by the time the gates opened. With Tough Break's tripled Uber rate, you now only need 13 seconds to get stock Uber, which makes switching to Medic during setup a lot less annoying. The second general Medic buff was one that I guarantee most of you don't even know about. When healing an injured teammate, Medic's health regeneration is doubled, going from 3 to 6 health per second up to 6 to 12 health per second. Yes, this is still in the game today, and is something that every medic should be aware of. If you're low on health, just latch onto an injured teammate and you'll get back to full health significantly faster than usual. Knowing this, you can afford to play much closer to the front line. If everyone around you is injured, that means you'll have an easier time staying healthy. Overall, a great change. But it also, astonishingly, gives players even less reason to use the amputator. I'm surprised that was even possible, to be honest. If you know about this mechanic, the amputator's health regen boost is 100% worthless. If you're at low health and there's an injured teammate nearby, just heal them with the medigun. For whatever reason, healing injured teammates with the amputator doesn't double your regen, so if you're trying to get health back quickly, using the amputator as opposed to the medigun actually hurts you. If your teammates aren't injured, then sure, taking the amputator out can boost your health regen. But in that scenario, you can't use the amputator's taunt because it doesn't overheal. So you'd just be standing there doing nothing just to get 1 more health per second. I could even argue that this new health regen mechanic gives players less reason to use the Blutsauger. Yeah, remember that thing? If you need health back quickly, just find an injured teammate. Now, I'm not saying there was 0 reason to use the Blutsauger. I'm not saying there was 0 reason to use the amputator, or the quick fix, or the Vitasaw, or the overdose. But you're starting to see the pattern by now, right? More and more, Valve's been taking the perks that had once been divided across several unlocks and dumping all of them into the crossbow, or onto Medic himself. They're putting all of their eggs into one basket, diluting Medic's weapon variety further and further. It isn't fair to say there was 0 reason to use these other unlocks, but there undoubtedly was less reason to use them than before. And no change demonstrated this more clearly than the Medigun speed buff made in the Meet Your Match update of 2016. The ability to mirror your patient's speed, which up until this point had been a unique perk of the quick fix, was given out like candy to every other Medigun. You cannot get any more literal than this. This isn't just unlocks having overlapping use cases anymore. Every Medigun can now do the exact thing that previously only the quick fix could do. Valve literally went back to the quick fix's stats and deleted one of its main listed upsides because it was no longer a quick fix upside. It was a medic upside. Without the quick fix's unique ability to mirror speed, the blast jump copying looks so out of place, doesn't it? What even is the quick fix's identity anymore? It's a skeleton of its former self. Hitching a ride off of scouts and demo knights with the quick fix was fun. Being able to do that now with any Medigun is even more fun. That much I cannot deny. Copying patient speeds with all Mediguns undoubtedly made Medic more fun overall by letting you get into and out of fights much faster. Like with the boosted health regen, this was a change that lets medics play much more aggressively, no matter their loadout. Scouts suddenly become extremely powerful pockets now that you can copy their speed while overhealing them fully and giving them an Uber that isn't the quick fixes. My question is, if Valve was gonna give away one of the quick fix's unique perks, would that not warrant some sort of rework for the quick fix itself? Especially after they'd also taken away its ability to cap while Ubered just a few months prior? Lo and behold, Valve actually did change something about the quick fix in this update. They nerfed it by dropping its Uber rate bonus from plus 25% down to plus 10%. In reality, this didn't change as much as you'd initially think. The quick fix still doesn't suffer from an overhealed Uber build penalty, so most of the time, this nerf equates to the quick fix's Uber taking just 5 more seconds to build than before. It's the principle of it all that's so insulting. Valve really took the quick fix, the weakest medigun in the game, the medigun that just lost one of its unique perks, and nerfed it without giving it anything new in return. My god, this poor unlock has been beaten into submission by Valve. Is it worthless? Of course not. The quick fix still has some uses, but it's gotten harder and harder to justify using the quick fix over time. Think of it this way. At one point, you used the quick fix because it let you heal faster, get Uber faster, and copy the speeds of faster patients. Sounds like a sweet package. But all of those things can now be done with the crossbow and with any medigun. All that leaves the quick fix with are its few remaining unique upsides that don't come together to form a cohesive weapon. Its Uber can top off multiple people quickly, which is great for defending, but not for breaking stalemates. Its Uber is also immune to knockback, which would have been great for breaking stalemates if only it didn't crumple to sentries or any amount of focus fire. And you can blast jump with your teammates, assuming you trust that they won't launch you directly into the enemy team. If you use the quick fix nowadays, you generally do so because you think it's neat. Which is valid. I like using weapons that are neat even if they aren't optimal. But ideally, unlocks should be neat and optimal in at least some situations. Especially on a class like Medic, where you'll receive the ire of your entire team for using anything that they deem to be suboptimal. At this point, you're probably wondering, where have the buffs been? Like buffs for things other than the crossbow, vaccinator, and Medic himself? Great question. Nowhere. Aside from the amputator, the last meaningful buff to an unlock that wasn't the crossbow or the vaccinator was the quick fix getting its overheal in 2013. Many of Medic's unlocks weren't just outclassed, they were outdated. Just look at the overdose. Once considered to be the Medic primary to use, it now barely registered as a blip on players' radars. Nothing about the unlock had changed. The overdose leading up to Meet Your Match was the exact same overdose from the Uber update 5 years prior. Which is why, in the Meet Your Match update, Valve finally did the thing that everyone says to do. The most obvious way to give medics more variety. They buffed a syringe gun. Not just any syringe gun, they buffed the overdose. As of this update, the overdose's speed bonus was doubled, going from plus 10% to plus 20%. In exchange, its damage penalty went up from minus 10% to minus 15%, causing each needle to deal 2 less damage at max ramp up as opposed to 1. This was huge. The damage penalty is basically as negligible as before, but now, medics using the overdose can run at up to 127% speed, just slightly slower than Scout. If you're close to full Uber and need to make a quick getaway, this new overdose makes it nearly impossible for anyone other than Scouts to chase you down. Previously, you needed to be at full Uber to backpedal at around normal medic speed. Now, you only need to be at half Uber, and having more Uber lets you backpedal even faster. In terms of survivability, the overdose is now far and away the best medic primary. And yet, Even after this buff, no one really cared about the overdose, because justifying using it beyond finding it neat is such an uphill battle. You need to be in a game where you're willing to trade the extra healing and uber building of the crossbow to potentially stay alive longer, in a situation where the vaccinator wouldn't get the job done while letting you continue to use the crossbow, in an environment without any scouts nearby to latch onto and get an even faster speed boost at any uber percent while still building uber. The overdose is not a bad weapon in its own right. It's easily Medic's second best primary, but that really isn't saying much. Meet Your Match was also the update that changed mediguns to no longer retain all uber upon a medic's death. It had been 1 year since gun metal, and awareness of this mechanic had spread to the point that most players agreed it was a bad idea. Had this stayed in the game, every single match with at least one medic would have had a capture the flag-esque side objective of protecting/stealing the dropped medigun with uber. Which honestly does sound interesting. I'd love to peer into an alternate reality where dropped mediguns still retain uber, just to see how radically it changed the way people play the game. With Meet Your Match, dropped mediguns now lose 10% uber per second following a medic's death. If you die with full uber and return to your medigun upon respawning, it'll always be completely drained by the time you get there. You know what that means, right? Vitasol bros, we are so back! If you wanted to retain any uber upon death, the Vitasol was the only way to do so once again. The Vitasol was not particularly popular even after regaining its unique niche, but at this point, we'll take any shred of weapon diversity that we can get. Reclaiming your own medigun after respawning is no longer an option. But if a different medic dies with uber right next to you, quickly picking up their medigun can still be worth doing. Situational, yes, but it does happen, and not enough medics seem to know that this is even an option. The last medic-related changes in Meet Your Match were made not to medic directly, but to pyro. Direct damage from all flamethrowers would now reduce medigun healing and vaccinator bubble resistances by 25%. Huh. So they wanted to turn pyro into a sort of anti-healer. That's cool, I guess. However, this new mechanic was one of the most laughably broken things to have ever been added to the game. Depending on the situation, flamethrowers actually reduced healing by 70%, or 40%, or 45%, or 34%, or 100% in the case of lone dispensers. Fast forward to Jungle Inferno in October of 2017, where Valve tried to fix their shoddy code. The healing debuff was lowered to 20% and moved from direct flamethrower damage onto afterburn. You'd think that this meant flare guns could now apply the debuff, but nope, it does not work for flare guns, nor the new Dragon's Fury. But it does work for all other flamethrowers, and the sharpened Volcano Fragment. Thank God. And the actual healing debuff applied by the afterburn of these weapons is decidedly not minus 20%. Once again, depending on the situation, healing rates are cut by wildly varying degrees. Most notably, the normal medigun's healing is cut in half. The vaccinator can't build any overheal, and dispensers of any level still can't heal at all. Only the vaccinator shield reductions function as advertised. Under the debuff, Vax Bubbles now only resist 60% of base damage and 80% of crit bonus damage, making flamethrowers a decent way to not counter the Vax, but at least slow it down. As for healing, flamethrowers other than the Dragon's Fury reduce it by much more than they're supposed to. With one lone exception. There is one unlock in Medic's arsenal that completely bypasses this debuff and heals the exact same amount as usual. Say it with me, folks. The Crusader's Crossbow.
You can't keep getting away with it! You can't keep getting away with it!
Yes, this was technically another buff to the crossbow. Arrow tanking someone that's fighting a pyro will heal a minimum of 6.25 times more health than with the medigun. Now, to be fair, Jungle Inferno also came with the first and only direct nerf to have ever been given to the crossbow. Its uber gain is now lowered to 1/3 when healing players that have recently taken damage, bringing its uber building potential in line with that of the stock medigun. This was a legitimate nerf. The crossbow used to let you build uber even faster than with just the medigun, and now that isn't the case. The quick fix and amputator are now slightly less overshadowed than before. But in terms of bringing the crossbow any closer to the syringe guns, yeah, this changed basically nothing. Interestingly, the patch notes claimed that the crossbow was the fastest way to build uber, which, no, it wasn't. Yeah, I know what they meant. The crossbow was the fastest way to build uber with your team. But if Valve had a problem with unlocks that let you build uber faster than with the medigun, you'd think that they'd also re-examine the uber saw. Which is why Medic's final change from Jungle Inferno, TF2's final major update, was a nerf to one of Medic's melees. You know which one I'm talking about, the melee with that vial that fills up as you build uber? That's right, Valve finally, after all this time, gave a well-deserved nerf to the Vitasol. They nerfed the Vitasol. Granted, they didn't mean for this to be a nerf so much as a rework. Instead of automatically storing uber upon death simply for having the Vitasol equipped, you now need to work for it. Every successful hit with the Vitasol grants you one vital organ, with each organ you collect preserving 15% uber on death, up to a max of 60%. Thematically, love it. It fits the name. The Vitasol collects vital organs. Valve even went the extra mile and made an actual organ pop out of anyone hit by the Vitasol. That's cute, they didn't have to do that. As an actual weapon, however, it is utterly and hopelessly outclassed by none other than the Ubersaw, the melee that gives you actual uber for every hit without cutting into your longevity in any way. If you land a hit with the Vitasol without dying shortly after, then you would have been much better off using the Ubersaw. Or if you land a hit with the Vitasol and later die right after popping uber, leading to you respawning with 3% uber. Or if you respawn with uber that you stored with the Vitasol only to die without hitting anyone and starting back at 0% on the next life. Or if you die with the Vitasol without having hit anyone. The only situation where the Vitasol would be ideal is if you're under 75% uber and manage to get one hit in right before you die. But if you find yourself in that situation often, then chances are you aren't playing medic right. So, despite never being particularly popular in pubs, the Vitasol was now near useless. Past Jungle Inferno, the final medic-related change worth noting came years later in June of 2022, and it was a major bug fix for the Crusader's crossbow. Of course, as of this update, the crossbow's projectile would no longer pass through teammates at point blank, which had been a somewhat rare but still irritating occurrence up until now. And really, I can't think of a better way to end this story than Valve, 5 years after Jungle Inferno, emerging from their slumber just to make the crossbow even better. And nearly 2 decades after TF2's release, this is the state that Medic remains in today. So how has Medic evolved since then? In the months leading up to TF2's launch, after slaving away at the game for years on end, Valve had felt that Medic's design was airtight, revolutionary even. They'd gone so far as to call Medic among their proudest achievements. And for the most part, they were right to be proud. Medic wasn't just a healer, he also had the ability to turn anyone into an unstoppable god with his ubercharge. But he first had to stay alive long enough to build that ubercharge. Not an easy task, given the middling self-defense that the syringe gun and bone saw offered. Medics would need to constantly watch their backs and dodge enemy fire as they followed their teammates into the thick of battle. All the while, they'd watch that Uber meter slowly fill up until they could finally pop it and enjoy the massive dopamine rush of watching their pocket destroy everything in their path. The idealized gameplay loop for Medic was one of constant decision-making, constant action, constant fun. Yet, once players finally got their hands on the game, they quickly found that this idealized Medic often didn't match reality. Medic couldn't survive on the front line by himself. He needed competent power classes alongside him that knew to protect him. And in the many games where this wasn't the case, all a Medic could do to build Uber was hide away from the action. The one thing that Valve had explicitly stated they did not want Medics to feel like they needed to do. Following TF2's release, Valve immediately went back to the drawing board for Medic. The Gold Rush update granted Medic 3 new unlocks just a few months later, including the fan-favorite Ubersaw. From there, Valve played things completely by the books with Medic. They fixed bugs and exploits. They added countless quality of life improvements. And they released unlocks that added more to Medic's core gameplay. More nuance, more excitement, more fun. By mid-2013, all of Medic's unlocks had been balanced immaculately. Not a single one was overpowered, and not a single one was overshadowed. Each unlock offered their own twist on Medic's gameplay that couldn't be replicated with any other unlock, all without harming the game or straying too far from Medic's identity as a healer. Valve had done everything right, and yet it still wasn't enough. Players were still frustrated by Medic's design for one reason or another. Valve had hit a fork in the road, and ultimately, they chose to upend the balance within Medic's kit that they had just spent the past 6 years striving to create, all in the name of making Medic more fun. There, of course, was the crossbow gaining its passive reload, allowing it to heal even faster than the Medigun on top of its usual long-range healing. This alone left the Overdose and Blutsauger in the dust, and stole much of the spotlight away from the Amputator and the Quick Fix. Then Valve gave all Mediguns the ability to boost Medic's health regen, in the same update that inadvertently nerfed the Amputator's own regen boost. Then they gave all Mediguns the ability to copy their patient's speed, in the same update that nerfed the Quick Fix's Uber rate. And not long after, the Quick Fix had lost its ability to cap while Ubered. As if the Quick Fix hadn't been humiliated enough, there was also the time that the crossbow let you heal more and build Uber faster than the stock Medigun, while the Vaccinator continues to let you cap while Ubered despite the Quick Fix losing its ability to do the same. They'd let any Medic retain all of their or anyone else's Ubers via picking up dropped Mediguns, leaving the already unpopular Vitasol without any use. Then they nerfed picking up Ubers, only to completely dumpster the Vitasol 1 year later. It's no wonder why complaints about Medic's lack of weapon variety are so common nowadays. The crossbow is the best Medic primary by a long shot. The Ubersaw is the best Medic melee by a long shot. And as for the Mediguns, Stock and the Kritzkrieg play exactly the same aside from when you're Ubered. The Quick Fix is a fringe pick, and the Vaccinator requires you to sell your soul first. It didn't have to be this way, but keep in mind why Valve chose this path. They wanted to make Medic more fun. The crossbow is hilariously overtuned. No one unlock should be able to do that much. Yet, is that not why we love using it? That's a genuine question, by the way. Why do we love using the crossbow? Because, at least for me, almost all of my love for the crossbow comes from how overtuned it is. Every time I see a teammate at low health, the calculations start running through my head. Should I heal them with the Medigun or the crossbow? The Medigun's safer, but much slower. If I miss the crossbow, I can at least hit the next arrow to still surpass what I would have healed with the Medigun. Are they moving predictably enough for me to land at least 1 out of 2 arrows on them? What if they're actively fighting someone? Then the burst healing of the crossbow would be even more impactful if I land. yet the total lack of healing would be even more devastating if I miss. However, the vast majority of medics I see out in the wild do not use the crossbow in this way. In my experience, most medics simply use the crossbow for healing people outside of their medigun's range. If that's the case, then it could be argued that giving the crossbow its passive reload was a mistake, because before that buff, the crossbow could still dish out those long-range heals just fine. Imagine an alternate timeline where medic is exactly the same as today, except for the crossbow having its passive reload. The medic of that timeline would have much more weapon variety. The overdose might actually be the generally superior primary, though it'd be a close call. The amputator's taunt would be more valuable as well, potentially letting it rival the Ubersaw like it once had in the past. I could even take it further. Imagine if the medigun speed boost also never happened. That would make the quick fix stand out much more than it does now. How much would you be willing to give up in the name of weapon variety? I hear what some of you are saying, that I'm thinking about this all wrong. Instead of reverting the buffs given to medics' meta weapons, I should be proposing more buffs to the lesser used ones. Giving the needle guns passive reloads would be a no-brainer, but that still wouldn't be enough for any one of them to come close to the crossbow. No, they'd require more radical changes, like the overdose's speed boost becoming passive. Or for the amputator to seriously rival the Ubersaw, it'd need to do something that even the crossbow can't do, like letting its taunt overheal. And maybe that could have worked out. There could have been yet another alternate timeline where we have the current crossbow and Ubersaw, and beefed up versions of the other unlocks. My point is, I can't blame Valve for not taking that gamble and risking breaking the game over half a decade after its release. I can't blame Valve for taking the safer option of putting all of their eggs into that one crossbow-shaped basket. Put yourself in Valve's shoes. What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for watching, and special thank you to my patrons.